What if the Night King won the Battle of Winterfell and marched on King's Landing? What if a single heartbeat could decide the fate of the living? Not a battle, not a war, a heartbeat. The space between one moment and the next, so small that no strategist could account for it, no plan could accommodate it, no foresight could bend around it. Consider the godswood at Winterfell, where the snow falls not gently, but in swirling sheets, driven sideways by a wind that carries the cold of something older than winter itself. The weirwood stands at the center, its carved face weeping red sap that looks, in this darkness, almost like blood. Beneath it sits a boy who is no longer entirely a boy. His eyes rolled white, his mind scattered across 100 distant places, riding the wings of ravens over frozen fields, watching, searching, calculating. Bran Stark is not present in his own body. He is everywhere and nowhere, and this is the flaw in the plan. This is the gap in the design. Theon Greyjoy understands the arithmetic of his situation. He does not speak it aloud, but he knows it. He knows that he is one man with a broken spear, where once there was a whole one. He knows that the whites press in from every direction, that his defenders have thinned to almost nothing, that the ground before him is littered with the fallen and the risen again fallen. And he knows, above all, what he must protect. He has calculated the value of the boy behind him against the value of his own life, and he has arrived at the only answer that a man seeking redemption can arrive at. He charges. It is a good charge, a brave one. In another telling of these events, in the version where the ledger balances, it is enough. Theon reaches the Night King. Theon delays him. Theon buys the seconds that a young woman with a dragonglass dagger requires to close the distance and end the long night. But this is not that telling. In this telling, the arithmetic fails by the smallest possible margin. The spear does not find its mark. The Night King does not slow. Theon Greyjoy is cut down a single heartbeat too early, and that heartbeat is the difference between salvation and catastrophe. The Night King steps forward through the falling snow. He does not hurry. Why would he? He has learned, across the long millennia of his patience, that hurry is the vice of mortal creatures, of things that fear the running out of time. He has no such fear. He walks toward the weirwood tree with the measured tread of something that has already won and is merely completing the paperwork of victory. The whites around him fall still, as if in reverence, or perhaps merely in obedience. The wind seems to gather at his back, and Bran, still riding the ravens, still watching the walls of Winterfell through borrowed eyes, has no time. This is the second flaw exposed. He had counted on the heartbeat that Theon was to purchase. He had built his intention around it, whatever that intention was, whatever revelation or resistance or final gambit the three-eyed raven had prepared. We will never know what it was. That is the cruelty of the moment. Bran returns to himself, to the frail body strapped into the chair, just in time to look up into a face carved from ice and see, in those pale blue eyes, the reflection of every mistake that led to this instant. The Night King reaches out. His hand closes around the boy, and then, without ceremony, without triumph, without any expression at all, he drives the ice blade forward and through. Consider what dies in that moment. Not merely a boy, not merely the last male heir of House Stark. The three-eyed raven is not a person so much as a repository, a living archive of everything that has ever been seen, every memory ever recorded in the roots of the weirwoods, every thread of the past woven together into a single continuous vision. When the blade enters Bran Stark, that archive does not pass to another. It does not scatter to be gathered again. It is extinguished, the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years, the memory of the first men, the record of the children of the forest, the sight that could have guided the living through the darkness ahead. All of it goes dark in an instant, like a candle pinched between two fingers. The living are severed from their past, and any hope of foresight, of knowing what comes next, of anticipating the moves of the enemy, dies with the boy beneath the tree. The Night King does not linger over his kill. He has calculated his next move already, as he calculated all the others, and he executes it with the cold efficiency of a mind that has never once acted on impulse. He raises both arms. Beneath Winterfell, in the crypts where the Starks have laid their dead for 8,000 years, something stirs. The bones in the stone tombs, the ancient lords and forgotten kings, the recent dead and the long decayed, all of them open eyes that have no eyes to open, and in that black and sacred space where the living had been sent for safety, where the non-combatants had gathered, believing the earth itself would shield them, the dead rise. Tyrion Lannister has been thinking, as he always thinks, about the odds. He has been counting the ways this night might end, arranging them in his mind, from the likely to the impossible, and in none of his calculations did he account for the enemy at his back rather than beyond the walls. Sansa Stark stands beside him, dragonglass in her hand, her face composed in the manner she has spent years perfecting, the mask that reveals nothing. She hears the stone crack first. She turns. There is no charge to meet here, no line to hold. The crypt is a closed space, and the dead fill it from within, from the very walls, from the floors themselves. The defensive core of Winterfell, the shelter, the reserve, the last redoubt, collapses not from without, but from beneath, in a single catastrophic sweep that no plan had prepared for, because no plan had imagined the boy could fall. Above, the Night King lowers his arms. The godswood is silent now, save for the wind and the soft red weeping of the tree. He turns his pale gaze south, toward the walls, toward the gates, toward the long road that leads away from this ruined castle and down into the heart of the living world. And he begins, without haste, without doubt, to consider the distance yet to march. Consider the geometry of a battle already lost, and how long it takes for the men still fighting it to understand that the outcome has been decided somewhere beyond their sight. Jon Snow does not understand it yet. He is mid-charge across the outer courtyard, on foot now, his dragon, somewhere in the black sky above and beyond his reach, and his mind is still fixed upon the single point that had governed every calculation of this night. The godswood, the Night King, the idea that if that one figure could be reached and ended, the entire host of the dead would fall with him, every white and every reanimated horse collapsing into the mud from which they had risen. That was the strategy. That was the whole of it. Every other decision had been made in service of buying the time and the ground to reach that single point. And then, Viserion's fire scatters the men in front of him. Blue, the wrong color, the color that tells him everything before his thoughts can arrange the meaning of it into words. The dragon he had loved once, now belonging to the enemy, sweeps low over the ranks of the living and washes them in flame that does not warm but consumes. And the line that Jon had been running to reinforce simply ceases to be a line. It becomes scattered figures, and then it becomes nothing. He screams for a retreat. The word leaves him with everything he has, but the courtyard is a wall of sound, the roar of the dead layered over the screams of the dying, and the men nearest him cannot hear it, and the men farthest cannot know it comes from him. A commander's authority depends upon the transmission of his will. Strip away the ability to be heard, and a king becomes merely a man shouting into a storm. Jon understands this in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The battle is no longer his to direct. It has passed beyond direction entirely. All that remains is the arithmetic of survival, and even that arithmetic is turning against the living faster than anyone can count. Above, Daenerys Targaryen is falling out of the sky. Not in the literal sense, not yet, but in every sense that matters. Drogon has been driven off, harried and clawed by a swirling mass of the winged dead, until the beast's instinct for self-preservation overrode his rider's commands. And now she is on the ground, unhorsed and dragonless, a queen without the single instrument that had made her a queen. She is wounded. The cold has entered a gash along her side that she cannot feel and cannot afford to feel, and she is not thinking of escape. This is the crucial thing to understand about her in this moment. She is thinking of vengeance. She is thinking of the North that she came to save and the price it is extracting from her, and some ancient Targaryen fury is whispering that she should stay, that she should call the dragon back, that fire and blood must answer this. Jorah Mormont does not permit it. He has found her in the chaos, as he has always found her, and he is dragging her toward the southern side of the field, where the press of the dead is thinnest, and where a path, however narrow, might still exist. A wight comes for her back, and he puts himself between them. The blade goes into him, and he does not stop. He turns and kills the thing, and turns back, and keeps dragging her. And the wound in him is mortal, and both of them know it. And still he does not stop until they reach a wall where she can go on, and he cannot. He tells her to flee south, not to avenge, not to fight, to live, and to carry the war she was truly born to fight, to the place where it might yet be won. He does not ask her to promise. He knows the value of a promise extracted from the grieving. He simply tells her, and then the strength leaves him, and she goes because his last living act was to make her go. Elsewhere on the field, the calculus of the ambush has failed. Arya Stark had a plan, and the plan was elegant in its economy. Let the dead come. Let the defenders draw the Night King forward, and then, from the dark, the killing stroke that no army could deliver, a single girl and a single blade at the single throat that mattered. It was the best hope the living had. It required only that certain pieces remain in place long enough for her to reach her position. Theon Greyjoy was one of those pieces. Theon fell early, and with his fall the timing of the ambush unraveled. The window she needed collapsed before she could pass through it, and Arya found herself not the assassin she had trained her whole life to become, but simply another soldier trapped in a losing fight. She does not waste time mourning the plan. That is the discipline in her, the thing the faceless men gave her, that Winterfell never could. A plan that has failed is a plan to be abandoned, and the only question that matters now is which of the remaining moves keeps the most of the living alive. She cuts her way across the courtyard toward the broken gate, and she finds Sandor Clegane there, and beside him, Beric Dondarrion with his sword aflame, the last flickering light in a field going dark. The three of them form up without discussion, because there is nothing to discuss. The gate is broken. The survivors are streaming through it toward the road south, and someone must stand in the gap and hold it long enough for those survivors to become distance rather than corpses. So they hold it, three against a tide that has no bottom. Beric's flaming blade carves arcs of orange light, and Clegane's brute strength answers every wight that comes within reach, and Arya moves between them, like water finding the spaces they cannot cover. They are not winning. Winning was never the objective. They are buying minutes, and each minute costs blood, and they spend it willingly because the alternative is that the last free people of the North die here in the mud of a courtyard while their killers march on unopposed. Beric takes a wound, then another, and the tide keeps coming, and the road behind them is not yet empty. What if survival is not a victory, but merely a deferment? What if the road south is not an escape, but only a longer death, measured in miles rather than minutes? These are the calculations that shape the hours after Winterfell falls, and they are calculations made by exhausted people who have run out of better options. If you're enjoying this alternate history of Westeros so far, please consider subscribing. I upload new stories every single day. Now, let's continue with the story. The survivors gather many miles south of the castle that was once the heart of the North, in the gray light before a dawn that brings no warmth. They come in ragged clusters along the King's Road, and they come slowly, because the wounded slow the whole, and because no one has the strength to move faster than grief allows. Jon Snow counts them as they arrive. He does not mean to count. He simply cannot stop the part of his mind that measures, that weighs, that reduces catastrophe to numbers, because numbers are the only thing he can still hold. 2,000, perhaps a few more if the stragglers keep coming. 2,000, living against an army that grows with every corpse it claims, an army that now includes the men who died defending these very hills. Every soldier lost is a soldier gained by the enemy. The arithmetic is not merely bad. The arithmetic is a trap that tightens with each engagement, a war that the defenders cannot fight without feeding. Grey Worm brings what remains of the Unsullied, and they march in formation still, because formation is all they have left, because discipline is the last refuge of men who have watched their brothers die and cannot afford to feel it yet. The Dothraki are a scattered remnant, a fraction of the horde that charged into darkness with flaming erics and vanished. Brienne walks beside Jaime, and neither speaks, and their silence carries the particular weight of two people who expected to die together and did not, and are not certain how to carry the gift of unwanted survival. Davos moves among the wounded with the practiced calm of a man who has survived a great many disasters by refusing to indulge in despair during any of them. Behind them, the pursuit continues, and it is only slowed because someone chose to buy that slowness with the last thing he had to spend. Beric Dondarrion dies for the final time in a ravine some hours back along the road. He has died before, 6 times, 7, he lost the count long ago, and each time the Red God returned him to a purpose he never fully understood. Now the purpose becomes clear in the way all things become clear at their ending. There is a narrow place where the road threads between high walls of frozen stone, and above it a shelf of rock and ice waits, precarious, held by nothing but habit. Beric climbs to it with the dead already flooding into the ravine below. He sets his flaming sword to the ice at the base of the overhang, and he waits, and he lets the wights come, and when there are enough of them beneath him that the collapse will matter, he does what he came to do. The stone falls, the ice falls, the ravine closes, and the pursuit is not stopped, because nothing stops it, but it is delayed, and delay is now the only currency the living possess. He does not rise again. There is no fire left in him to spend. The hound carries Arya away from that place, and she fights him the entire distance. She has watched 3 hold the gate, and only 2 walk away. And now Beric is gone as well, and she wants to turn back. She insists on turning back. because turning back is the shape her grief takes when it cannot become anything useful. Clegane does not release her. He has never been gentle, and he is not gentle now. But there is something in the set of his jaw that is not cruelty. Turning back is dying, he tells her. Turning back accomplishes nothing but adding one more corpse to their ranks. And she screams that she does not care, and he answers that he does. And the exchange crystallizes the new law that governs every survivor on that road. The war is no longer about killing the enemy. The enemy cannot be killed in numbers that matter. The war is now about outrunning extinction, about becoming distance faster than the dead can close it. Every instinct to fight, to avenge, to stand, every noble impulse that made these people who they are, must now be measured against a single brutal metric. Does it help us run? And if it does not, it is a luxury they cannot afford. At the head of the column, Jon and Daenerys argue in the low, controlled voices of two commanders who cannot let the ranks hear them disagree. She wants White Harbor. She wants the coast, the ships, the sea between her people and the thing that follows them. Consolidate, embark, sail south to ground of their own choosing, and let the North become a frontier that buys the living time to prepare. It is sound strategy. It is, in fact, the only strategy that keeps the greatest number of her people breathing. And she is a queen who has learned to count her people the way Jon counts them now. Jon does not disagree with the logic. He disagrees with what the logic omits. Someone must warn the South. Someone must ride ahead of the dead and reach King's Landing and every holdfast between here and there, because a sealed harbor and a fleet at sea protect the 2,000 who reach the ships and abandon the millions who do not. If they sail and say nothing, they purchase their own survival with the ignorance of the entire realm. She reminds him that the realm would not listen, that Cersei will not believe, that warnings have been sent before and dismissed as northern superstition. He reminds her that the difference between a warning heard and a warning ignored is not their concern. The sending is. And beneath the strategy, beneath the maps neither of them holds, and the numbers both of them carry, there is another thing unspoken, festering in the space between them, the truth of who he is, the truth she learned, and he confirmed, and neither has spoken since the dead came pouring over the walls. It sits between them like a third rider, silent, patient, waiting for a moment that has not yet arrived. And when the argument ends without resolution, as it must, Jon turns his horse toward the front of the column and says the words that decide it. He says, they ride south, and he says, they send the ravens, and he says, they do both, because a man who chooses only one has already surrendered the other. The words settle over the column like frost. There is no vote, no council, no ceremony. There is only a decision made in the cold by a man who has died once already and has learned to spend himself without hesitation, and the retreat, which had been a stumbling southward drift, becomes a thing with a spine. The wolf's wood swallows them by degrees. What if a forest could hold its breath? These trees do. The pines stand black and close, their branches heavy with snow that does not melt, and the column threads between them in a line that stretches for miles. Ox carts and litters and the walking wounded, mothers with children bound to their chests, old men leaning on spears they can no longer lift to fight. The cold is not weather. The cold is a presence, patient and total, and it presses against every exposed inch of skin like a hand testing for weakness. Fires are permitted only at the center of the column, where the smoke can rise unseen through the canopy, and even then, the wood is wet and the flames are grudging. The dead come at night. They always come at night. White outriders, faster than the shambling mass behind them, sent ahead like the fingers of a reaching hand to test where the living are soft. They do not charge. They probe. A cart at the rear falls behind, a wheel splintered on a frozen route, and by morning the family that guarded it is gone, and the family is also, by then, the enemy, raised, reoriented, marching back the way they came. This is the arithmetic that has begun to define the war. Every loss is doubled. Every corpse the living cannot burn becomes a soldier for the other side. Daenerys understands this now, with a clarity that keeps her from sleep. She commands an army that grows smaller with each mile. Her enemy commands an army that grows larger with each death, including the deaths she inflicts. Brienne and Jaime organize the rearguard between them, though neither speaks the arrangement aloud. It simply forms, the way ice forms, gradual and then complete. They divide the night into watches and rotate the mounted men, who can still hold a torch and a blade, and they ride at the very back of the column where the danger lives, because both of them have decided, separately and identically, that this is where they belong. On the third night, with the column strung out along a road too narrow for two horses abreast, Jaime rides beside her in a silence that has grown comfortable and then, without preamble, breaks it. He tells her he does not think he will see the south again. He says it plainly, the way a man reports the weather, not as despair, as accounting. He has done the sum, and the sum comes out short, and he has made his peace with the remainder. Brienne does not answer at once. She watches the tree line, where the shadows have a way of moving against the wind. She tells him he is the finest man she has ever fought beside, and that she does not intend to let him die in a forest. He laughs, quietly, the sound of a man surprised by his own capacity for warmth this late in his life. He does not argue with her. He does not need to. He simply lets the moment hold, the two of them riding at the end of the world, and there is in his silence a thing that is almost gratitude and almost love and entirely unspoken. What if the measure of the North's fall could be counted not in battles, but in silence? Word travels down the column in fragments, passed mouth to mouth from riders who have ranged ahead and behind. The dead do not tire. This is the sentence that repeats, that spreads, that lodges in the mind of every soul who hears it. They do not sleep. They do not stop to eat, or to warm themselves, or to bury their fallen, because they have no fallen, and no fear, and no need. They move as a tide moves, without malice and without mercy, filling every space the living vacate, and the proof of their advance arrives as absence. The ravens stop coming. A holdfast that answered yesterday answers no longer. A village that raised its smoke against the gray sky raises nothing now. One by one the small lights of the north wink out, and the maester who rides with them keeps a tally he no longer bothers to share, because the tally only moves in one direction. And then, on the fifth day, a shadow crosses the canopy that is not a cloud. Drogon comes down in a clearing where the trees have been thinned by some old fire, and Daenerys goes to him alone, on foot, through snow to her knees. He is not the dragon she remembers. What if strength could be made to look like ruin? He lands badly, one wing dragging, and along his flank the scales are cracked and blackened where his brother's blue fire found him. He does not settle when she approaches. He flinches. This is the thing that stops her heart. Not the wound, but the flinch, the skittish backward jerk of a creature who has learned that the sky is no longer his alone. He has met Viserion above the field, and he has learned what she is only now beginning to accept, that the ice dragon does not feel pain, that it does not tire, that it can be hurt and will not care, and that this makes it, in every way that matters, the superior beast. She lays her hand against his neck and feels him tremble, and she does the arithmetic she cannot escape. One dragon, wounded and afraid, against an enemy that grows stronger from every corpse her fire cannot reach. She had come north with 3. She had come north believing that dragons ended wars, and now she stands in a burned clearing in a dying forest, whispering to a creature who will not stop shaking, and she understands, at last and too late, what it costs to bring fire to a war that feeds on the fallen. Behind her, faint through the trees, a horn sounds 3 times. The rear guard. The dead have found the tail of the column again. What if the most important survivor of Winterfell was not a warrior at all, but a fat, frightened man who had never won a single duel in his life? Samwell Tarly had fled the crypts before the stone women began to stir. He had gathered Gilly and the child in his arms, and he had run, not toward glory but away from it, and this cowardice, if that is what it was, had made him one of the last living men who understood how the dead could be killed. He carried that knowledge in his head like a burning coal, and it terrified him more than any white, because he understood what it meant. He was no longer merely a man. He was an archive, and an archive, he knew from years buried in the vaults of the Citadel, was only useful if it survived long enough to be copied. He finds the survivors on the 3rd night, huddled in the ruins of a holdfast whose name no one remembers. There are fewer of them than there should be. He does not count them aloud. He has learned that counting the living is a way of measuring the dead, and no one wants the arithmetic. He pushes through them, breathless, the baby fussing against Gilly's chest, and he finds Davos beside a guttering fire, and he says the thing he has practiced saying for 3 days. The knowledge cannot die with them. Dragonglass, Valyrian steel, the forge at Dragonstone. The way the blades cut through the cold, like the cold or nothing at all. It must be written down. It must be sent south. It must be spread to every maester and smith and lord who might yet raise a weapon that matters, because an army that does not know how to kill the dead is not an army. It is a supply line. Davos listens. Davos, who cannot read well, who spent a lifetime running goods past customs galleys, understands supply lines better than any man alive. He does not argue. He simply asks how many ravens they have, and where the nearest maester's rookery still stands, and whether the birds will fly through the storm the dead seem to carry with them like a second army. And when Sam cannot answer that last question, Davos nods slowly, because he has already guessed that the answer is no more than a hope. They draft the letters by firelight. Sam writes them because his hand is steadiest, and because he knows the language that maesters trust. He writes to the Vale, to the Riverlands, to King's Landing. He writes plainly, Winterfell has fallen. The dead march south. The blades that kill them are dragonglass and Valyrian steel, and here is how they are made, and here is how they are used. And for the love of every god old and new, believe this letter before it is too late to believe anything at all. They send the birds into the dark. They watch them vanish over the tree line, small pale shapes swallowed by a sky that is not entirely a sky anymore. And here is the cruelty of it. The letters are true. Every word is true. And truth, dispatched to the wrong men, is worth precisely nothing. The raven that reaches the Vale is read by a steward who does not trust the North and never has, and it is set aside for a lord who is a boy, and the boy is distracted by other things. The raven that reaches the Riverlands finds a country so gutted by war that no one has men to spare, even for a threat they believe, and belief without power is only a slower kind of despair. and the raven that reaches King's Landing is carried, at last, into the presence of the one person in all of Westeros for whom the truth is most inconvenient of all. Cersei Lannister reads it twice. She does not react the way a frightened woman would react. She reacts the way a queen at war reacts, which is to say, she does not ask whether the letter is true. She asks who benefits if she believes it. This is the whole of her genius, and the whole of her ruin, folded into a single reflex. She holds the parchment to the candle, and watches the edge blacken, and she thinks it through the way she thinks through everything, backward, from the outcome to the intent. The letter tells her the North is dying. The letter begs her to send her armies north. The letter arrives at precisely the moment the Targaryen girl needs the South to weaken itself. She sees the shape of it instantly. A trick, a ploy, dressed in the language of apocalypse, designed to lure her strength out of the capital and into a grave 400 leagues from her throne. She has spent her whole life being told terrible things by men who wanted her to move where they pointed, and she has survived by refusing to move. She lets the parchment burn to her fingertips before she drops it. "Send no men north," she says, "not one." And when Qyburn, ever careful, ever watching, suggests that some fragment of the report might warrant caution, she turns on him the full flat weight of her certainty. "If the dead are real," she tells him, "then the North will kill the girl's armies for her, and the girl's dragons, and the girl herself, and Cersei will inherit a continent scoured clean of every rival she has ever feared. And if the dead are not real, then she has lost nothing by disbelieving them. Either way, the arithmetic favors doing nothing. Either way, the smart move is to sit on the throne and let the North rot. It is, in the narrow logic of the game she has always played, a perfect calculation. It accounts for every player she can see. It fails only because there is a player on the board she cannot conceive of, one that does not want her throne, or her gold, or her death as a means to an end. One that wants only the death of everything, and grows stronger with every hour she wastes. She orders the Golden Company brought fully within the walls. She orders the harbor chains checked. She turns her attention to the war she believes she is fighting, and she does not once look north again. And far away, in a ruined holdfast, Sam Tarly waits for a reply that will not come, and the cold outside the firelight deepens by a single degree. What if survival is not the same as safety? What if a harbor full of ships is a promise that cannot be kept, and everyone standing on its docks knows it? White Harbor rises from the mouth of the White Knife like a stubborn insistence upon order, its walls white and clean against a sky the color of wet slate, and into its streets pour the ragged remnants of the North. They come frostbitten and hollow-eyed, dragging children and grief in equal measure, and Lord Wyman Manderley meets them at the Newcastle with tables of bread and salt and an expression that carries the weight of a man doing the arithmetic no one wishes to speak aloud. He has ships. He says so freely, offering them the way a drowning man offers rope. But the number of ships is not the number of people, and the difference between those two numbers is a mathematics of abandonment, half, perhaps less than half, and that only if the sailing is orderly, and nothing that has happened since Winterfell has been orderly. In the great hall of the Newcastle, beneath merman banners and the vaulted ceiling of a house grown fat on trade, the War Council convenes, and it is less a council than a wound being probed. The lords who remain argue for the ships. Sail south to the Reach, they say, or east across the narrow sea, to Essos, to anywhere the winter cannot follow. Put water between the living and the dead. It is the oldest instinct there is, the instinct to run, and it has the seduction of every simple answer to a complicated problem. Daenerys listens with her hands folded and her jaw set, and she is thinking, as she always thinks, about the shape of the board, about what running actually purchases, and at what price. Jon rises. He does not shout. He has stopped shouting somewhere on the road south, has learned that the men who survive are not the loud ones. He tells them what he knows, the way a man reads a ledger. Flight delays. Flight does not defeat. The dead do not tire, do not starve, do not need favorable winds. Take half the north to Essos, and the other half is left to die on this shore. And every man who dies is not a man lost but a soldier gained, standing up again with blue eyes and joining the host that will build boats, or find them, or simply walk the long way round the world until it finds every last hiding place. There is no exile far enough. There is only the delay, and the delay costs everything. Then where? One lord asks, the word half a challenge and half a plea. Moat Cailin. Jon says it and the room shifts, because they all know the place, the ancient ruin that guards the causeway through the neck, where the swamp closes in on both sides, and the only path is a ribbon of raised stone, barely wide enough for a column to march. 100 men have held that causeway against 10,000. The terrain does the work that numbers cannot. On open ground, the dead simply flow around a line and overwhelm it from every side. But at the moat, there are no sides. There is only the front, narrow and murderous, where the swamp swallows everything that steps from the road, and a small force can bleed a limitless one, drop by drop by drop. It is not victory. Jon is careful to say that it is not victory. It is a choke point, a place to make the killing expensive, a place to buy time with lives instead of trading lives for nothing. Daenerys weighs it. She distrusts the plan, and she distrusts the man who offers it, because she has learned that Northmen have a way of mistaking their own martyrdom for strategy, of falling in love with the noble last stand, as though dying beautifully were the same as winning. She says as much, coldly, and Jon does not flinch. He agrees. He tells her that a stand at Moat Cailin is worth nothing without dragonfire, that swords and swamp can slow the dead, but only fire can unmake them, that the causeway is a killing ground, only if something is doing the killing, on a scale swords cannot manage. And there, at last, the two arithmetics align. Drogon over the causeway. A river of flame poured onto a bottleneck the width of a road. She sees it. She commits. Not for glory, and not for the North, and not for Jon, but because the numbers finally favor a stand instead of a flight, and she has always been a creature of the favoring numbers. They do not notice, in the heat of it, that one seat at the table has emptied. Arya left when the argument turned to ships. She heard the word exile and understood in an instant that exile was another word for surviving without purpose, and surviving without purpose is a thing she stopped valuing on a road a long time ago. She has been many things: a hostage, a servant, a blind beggar, a faceless killer. She has been running her entire life, from Cersei's men, and from her own name, and from the memory of a father's head on a spike, and she is done running. There is a hunter's clarity in her now, cold and clean as the ice she killed once before. The dead have a general. Everything she has learned in every dark room, in every dark city, bends toward a single skill, and that skill is the killing of one particular person, quietly, from an angle no one is watching. She finds the hound where she knew she would find him, apart from the crowd, drinking, hating the room he sits in. She does not soften it. She tells him she means to shadow the Night King's host, to slip alongside its flank in the swamps and the ruins, to look for the second chance the battle at Winterfell denied her. She tells him she needs men who can move quiet and expect nothing. He calls her mad. He calls her a stupid girl chasing her own death. And then he stands, because he has followed her into worse, and because there is nothing left in the ships for a man like him either. A handful of scouts drift toward them in the courtyard's shadow, men with nothing to lose and old debts to the wolves. They gather their gear in silence, while the council behind them plans a wall, and Arya plans a knife, and neither yet knows that both will be needed before the end. What if the swamp itself could be made into a weapon? What if the very geography that had stalled 1,000 southern armies could be turned against an enemy that did not tire, did not bleed, did not break, but that still, for all its horror, had to walk somewhere, had to cross something, had to funnel its numberless dead through a gap in the earth no wider than a road? This is the thought that carries the living south to the ruins of Moat Cailin, and it is, for the first time since Winterfell, a thought with teeth in it. The old fortress is barely a fortress at all. 3 towers stand of the 20 that once guarded the neck, and those 3 lean drunkenly against the sky, their stones green with 1,000 years of moss, their halls open to the rain. But the ground remembers what the towers have forgotten. To the east lies bog that will swallow a man whole. To the west lies bog that will swallow a horse. And between them runs the causeway, the single narrow spine of solid ground on which any host must march if it means to bring the north to its knees. The living look at that road and they understand, in the cold arithmetic of desperation, that here at last the numbers can be forced to matter less. They fortify the towers with what little they have. They pile stone across the causeway's mouth. They dig their heels into the one place on the continent where the dead cannot simply flow around a flank like water finding the sea. And when the first wave comes, when the whites pour onto that road in the gray light, shoulder to shoulder because the marsh gives them no other choice, Drogon falls out of the low clouds with his mother on his back, and the fire comes down not as a scattered rain, but as a river, channeled by the same walls of bog that channel the dead. Thousands burn, thousands more press into the burning and burn in their turn, and the marsh drinks the ash, and for the first time, the defenders inflict real attrition, real loss, a true and measurable cost, paid in reanimated flesh. It should feel like a victory. It does not. Because the Night King has learned. He watched Winterfell fall not to his enemy's weakness, but to his own patience, and he has folded that lesson into himself the way he folds everything he takes. He does not send Viserion forward. He holds his stolen dragon in reserve, a blade kept sheathed, a threat that costs nothing to keep and everything to face. He commits his dead in waves instead, wave after wave after wave, and each wave the living burn to nothing is replaced by another that costs him only what he can always afford. He is trading flesh for time. He is trading the endless for the finite. And the living, watching their fire consume 10,000 corpses, come slowly to understand the cruelty buried in their own success. Every white they burn is a white he does not miss. Every soldier they lose is a soldier who will not come again. So the days grind. The stalemate settles over Moat Cailin, like the fog that never lifts from the neck, and it is a stalemate that favors the patient and murders the brave. The defenders hold the line and pay for it. They hold it again and pay again, and between the assaults, in the ragged quiet when the dead pull back to reform, and the smoke hangs unmoving over the black water, The living do the only thing left to the living. They remember that they are alive. Jaime and Brienne hold a stretch of the ramparts together because neither will fight anywhere the other is not. He has forgotten how to be afraid for himself. He learned that trick long ago in 100 careless charges. What he has not forgotten, what he has in fact only just discovered, is how to be afraid for someone else. He watches her fight, and his stomach turns to water every time a white comes near her, and he hates the feeling, and he would not trade it for anything he has ever owned. She fights the way she does everything, without doubt, without flourish, with a plain and terrible competence that leaves the dead in heaps at her feet. And in the quiet, leaning against cold stone with their breath fogging between them, they say the things that men and women say when the tally of their remaining hours has grown short enough to count. He does not make a speech of it. He is not, whatever the songs pretend, a man of speeches. He tells her, simply, that there is no one he would rather stand beside at the end of the world, and that he has stood beside a great many people, and that he means exactly what he says. She does not weep. She takes his hand in her mailed hand, and she holds it. And for one moment, on that ruined wall, above the marsh, and the ash, and the patient malice of the dead, there is warmth in the middle of the killing cold. A small, fierce, human warmth that no army of the dead can understand, and no fire can quite consume. The moment does not last. The moments never do. Because far to the north, a shape lifts from the tree line, pale as bone, ice trailing from its ruined wings. And the Night King has decided at last that patience has bought him all it will buy. Viserion rises. He does not scream as living dragons scream. He makes a sound like a glacier breaking, like the groan of the world's foundations shifting, and every soul on the ramparts feels it in their teeth. Daenerys sees him come. She turns Drogon toward the pale shape without a word, because there is nothing to say, because this was always going to happen, because the whole grinding stand at Moat Cailin has been, in the end, only a delay of this one meeting in the sky. Two dragons close across the gray air above the causeway, one burning, one frozen, and the men below crane their necks upward and forget for a moment the dead climbing the walls beneath them, because the thing that will decide everything is happening overhead, and there is nothing any of them can do but watch it begin. What if a battle could be decided not by the men who bled for it, but by two creatures who no longer belonged fully to the living world at all? Consider the arithmetic of that skyward meeting. 2 dragons remained to Daenerys once, and now she has one, and the Night King has taken the third and turned it against her, and so the contest above the marshes is not merely dragon against dragon. It is her against the ruin of her own child. It is the mother against the corpse she could not save. Drogon strikes first because Daenerys wills it so, because she has learned that hesitation is a kind of death, because the only advantage she holds is heat, and she must spend it before the cold takes it from her. He wheels beneath the pale shape and rakes upward, claws spread, and the two collide with a sound that carries for miles across the flat, wet country. The men on the walls flinch as one. The dead do not flinch. They climb. Above, the dragons tumble. They twist through the gray air locked together, teeth in wings, tails lashing, and where Drogon's fire washes over Viserion's flank, it does not char the flesh so much as make it steam and split, revealing beneath the frost-rimed hide something that should not still move and yet moves. Viserion answers not with flame, but with that terrible blue-white stream, the breath that is the opposite of breath, and it catches Drogon along one wing, and Daenerys hears her mount scream, feels the great muscles beneath her seize with a cold that has no bottom to it. She grips the ridges of his spine until her hands bleed. She does not let go. Letting go now is the only mistake she is not permitted. Watch how the two beasts fall through the sky in a spiral, neither willing to be the one who breaks away, because to break away is to expose the belly, and the belly is where death lives for both of them. They plunge toward the marshes and pull up at the last, so low that the reeds bend beneath them, and the standing water throws up a curtain of spray. And in that low turn, in that single instant when Viserion overextends, when the ice dragon reaches for a killing bite and finds only air, Drogon closes his jaws on the joint of the pale creature's wing and does what living things do to living things. He tears. The sound is enormous. It is the sound of something ancient coming apart. The wing separates, ice and sinew and the memory of feathers that never were, and Viserion, robbed of the one thing that kept him aloft, falls. He does not fall gracefully. He falls the way a mountain would fall, tumbling, striking the bog with a concussion that throws mud 100 feet into the sodden air, and the marsh swallows him to the shoulder and holds him there, thrashing, half sunk, ruined, and yet not ended. And here is the thing that Daenerys understands, even as she wheels Drogon away, even as she gasps at the frost eating into her mount's wing, even as the men below let out a ragged cheer that dies almost before it is born. The Night King has lost his dragon, and he is not troubled. She can feel it across the distance, the way one feels a change in weather. He watches Viserion sink into the mud, and he does not send the dead to defend him, does not rage, does not reach out with whatever will binds him to the beast. He has spent Viserion the way a general spends a company he can afford to lose, because the loss teaches him something, because now he knows the measure of the last living dragon and the woman who rides it, and the measure is this: she can win this exchange. She cannot win the next one. She has no second dragon in reserve. He does not need one either. That is the revelation that turns the victory to ash in her mouth. She has torn the wing from an ice dragon, and it has taught her nothing she wanted to learn. It has taught her that she cannot win by attrition, because attrition is a game the dead play better than anyone who has ever lived, because every soul she loses joins the enemy, and every soul the enemy loses costs him nothing at all. One dragon cannot hold a line that stretches for miles. One dragon cannot be everywhere the wall is breached, and the walls of Moat Cailin, she sees now, are already breached. Below her, at the western flank of the causeway, where the ground is softest and the old towers watch over water rather than road, the dead have found the place where the barrier fails. They do not need to breach it, in truth. They need only to walk through the marsh itself, wave upon wave of them wading and sinking and being trampled beneath by those who come after, building with their own drowned bodies a road across the impassable ground. What if a fortress that has held for 8,000 years falls not because its walls are broken, but because its greatest defense, the swamp that no army could ever cross, becomes a bridge of the dead? That is what she watches happen. The one advantage that made Moat Cailin unconquerable has been turned inside out. The marsh that stopped every living host now carries a host that does not care whether it lives. The order to abandon the moat is given, and it is given by men whose faces she cannot see from the height at which she circles, and she knows it is the right order, and she hates it. To hold now is to die encircled. To retreat is to open the way south, and there is no third barrier below this one, no natural line where the land itself will fight for them. Below Moat Cailin, the north gives way to the riverlands, and the riverlands are flat and rich, and full of the living, town after town, holdfast after holdfast, all of them fuel. The dead will spill into that country like water, finding the shape of a valley, and there will be nothing to slow them until they reach the walls men have built with their own hands. Drogon climbs, wounded, one wing stiff with a cold that no fire will fully thaw, and Daenerys turns him south because there is nowhere else to turn. Behind her, the towers of Moat Cailin stand empty against the failing light, and the dead pour past them without a sound. What happens to a country when it has already bled itself white and is asked to bleed again? The Riverlands know the answer before the question is fully spoken. This is a land that has been fought over so many times that its fields remember the shape of armies, the way a scar remembers the blade. Robb Stark won his victories here and lost his life at the Twins. Tywin Lannister burned these villages once already, sent his hounds and his mountains to teach the small folk what happens when they choose the wrong king. The Riverlords have been ground down through years of war until what remains is not a realm, but a scattering of survivors, clinging to walls, each one certain that the walls of the man next to him will fall first. And so the dead find them divided, which is to say, the dead find them exactly as they have always been. Consider Edmure Tully, freed from Lannister captivity, restored to Riverrun, a man who wants nothing more than to be the lord his father was. He receives the ravens from the north. He reads them by candlelight in the solar where Hoster Tully died, and his hands tighten on the parchment as the words arrange themselves into something he does not want to believe. An army of the dead, Winterfell fallen, Moat Cailin abandoned. He calls his banners. Of course he calls his banners. This is what a lord does, and Edmure has waited years for the chance to do it properly. But the calling of banners assumes that there is someone left to answer. The Blackwoods and the Brackens have hated each other for 1,000 years, and no threat from the north has ever been sufficient to make them stand shoulder to shoulder. The Freys are a house in disarray, their old lord dead, their sons squabbling over the twins like crows over a corpse. The Mallisters at Seaguard look to the sea in the west, not to the frozen doom marching down the neck. Each lord calculates, in the narrow arithmetic of the desperate, that his own walls are his own salvation. Each lord decides that the safest thing is to hold his own and let his neighbor absorb the first blow. It is the logic that doomed the river houses at every turn of the last war, and it dooms them now, because the dead do not need the living to unite in order to be defeated. The dead need only for the living to remain apart, and the living oblige. Edmure marches out with what he can gather. A river host, ragged, underfed, drawn from levies who have already survived one war and want no part of another. They meet the dead on the flat ground north of the Trident, and here the analyst must pause, because there is a lesson in the shape of what follows. An army of living men breaks in stages. First the flanks waver, then the center, then the retreat becomes a rout. And even in the worst defeats, there is a thing called flight, a scattering, 1,000 men running in 1,000 directions to live another day. An army facing the dead does not break this way. The dead do not pursue the runners with any particular hunger, because the dead do not need to catch you today. They can catch you tomorrow. Every man who falls in the panic, trampled or wounded, or simply dead of terror, rises within the hour and turns to face the direction he was fleeing. The battle north of the Trident is not lost when the levees break. It is lost the moment they are gathered, because gathering the living in one place is precisely what the enemy wants. Edmure survives, which is its own small tragedy, because survival means he must watch. He watches his levies scatter toward the vale, toward the mountain roads where the Arryns sit safe behind their bloody gate. He watches others flee south toward the Trident and beyond, toward the Crownlands, toward the great walls of the city they all imagine will save them. And he rides among the survivors with the same expression his father wore in his final days, the expression of a man who has done everything right by the old rules and discovered that the old rules no longer apply. River Run falls, not to assault but to time. The dead do not need to breach a wall when they can simply surround it and wait. And a castle full of the living is a castle full of provisions that will run out. Seaguard falls the same way. It's back to a sea that offers no escape to men without ships. The twins fall last, and there is a grim symmetry in it. The crossing where so many were murdered under guest right, becoming a crossing the dead walk unopposed. The river, a thing they do not need to cross, because they can walk beneath it, cold and patient, and climb the far bank as though the water were merely another kind of ground. But south of all this collapse, something else is taking shape, and it is worth watching closely. The survivors of Moat Cailin do not scatter. This is the crucial distinction, the thing that separates a defeat from an extinction. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen ride at the head of a column that grows rather than shrinks, because everywhere they pass, the fleeing find them and attach themselves to the only order remaining in a disordered land. A retreat, properly managed, is not a rout. It is a migration. It is a nation on the move, gathering weight as it goes. And the hardened core that came south from the wall and the north now becomes a magnet for every frightened family on the roads. Jon understands what he is building, even as he grieves the men he could not save. He rides the flanks himself, pulling stragglers into the column, refusing the temptation to move faster than the slowest among them, because a migration that abandons its weak becomes a mob, and a mob cannot fight. Daenerys watches from above on a wounded dragon, and she sees the shape of it spreading across the land, like a slow tide moving in the right direction. Northward, the towns burn one by one. Southward, the living gather, and the road fills. And the great question begins to form in her mind, the question that will decide everything. Where do they make the next stand? And whether the man who sits the Iron Throne will let them make it at all. What if the strongest fortress in Westeros were also the one most eager to hide behind its own walls? The Vale had always been a country apart, ringed by mountains that no army in living memory had ever crossed against its will, guarded by the narrow throat of the bloody gate where a handful of defenders could hold against a legion. The Vale had watched the wars of the realm from a great height and involved itself only when involvement suited it. This was its habit. This was its inheritance. And now, with the dead pouring south and the north falling silent, town by town, Jon Snow turned his eyes toward those mountains and remembered that Sansa had friends there, that Robin Arryn owed the Starks a debt older than the boy himself understood, that Lord Jon Royce had ridden knights to Winterfell once before, when the cause was just. He sent his appeal by Raven and by rider both, for a single message could be lost, and a cause this large could not be trusted to chance. The words were careful. They did not beg. Jon had learned that begging closed doors that reason might yet open. He wrote of the dead as a fact rather than a fear. He wrote of the Vale's strength not as a shield for the Vale alone, but as an anvil against which the living might break the enemy at last. He wrote of what came after, of a realm that would remember who had answered and who had turned away. In the high halls of the Eyrie, the lords of the Vale read those words and weighed them, and the weighing did not go as John had hoped. Jon Royce rose and spoke for war. He was old, and he was blunt, and he had seen enough of the world to know that mountains meant nothing to an enemy that did not need to breathe. Walls hold against men, he told them, because men grow hungry, and men grow cold, and men lose heart on a long siege. The dead do not hunger, the dead do not tire. The dead will wait beneath the bloody gate for 100 years if they must, and they will still be waiting when the last defender's grandson dies of old age above them. He argued that safety unshared was safety borrowed, that the only true wall was an army in the field, and that the Vale's knights, fresh and mounted and unblooded by the long retreat, might be the very weight that tipped the scale. They heard him, and then they overruled him. The cautious lords spoke of the passes. They spoke of generations who had prospered by staying out of southern quarrels. They spoke of the bloody gate, as their fathers had spoken of it, as a thing that had never failed and therefore could never fail. And the boy who ruled them, still more child than lord, nodded along to whichever voice had spoken last. And the voice that had spoken last counseled patience, isolation, the closing of the gate. The Vale would not march. The Vale would wait behind its stone and watch the realm below burn, trusting that the fire could not climb so high. Word of the refusal reached John on the road, and he did not curse and he did not weep. He simply folded the letter and held it a moment longer than he needed to before he passed it to the fire. And he watched the parchment blacken and curl, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the ash did not already say for him. But it was the enemy's answer that chilled the living most. The Night King did not turn toward the Vale. He did not test the bloody gate. He did not spend a single cold soldier on those impregnable passes. He looked at the mountains, at the one place that had refused to join the war, and he simply passed it by. He bent his march southward toward the softer country, toward the rich and unwarded lands where the harvest was fat and the castles were far apart, and the living were many and unready. He left the Vale to its walls. He left it isolated, untouched, irrelevant. And in that decision, the living read something worse than savagery. They read patience. A brute would have thrown itself against the gate and broken there, and the living could have taken comfort in a brute. But this enemy calculated. This enemy understood that a fortress that would not come out to fight had already removed itself from the war, that the men behind those walls had chosen to be food that waited rather than swords that struck, and that they could be collected later, at leisure, once the softer prey was gone. The Night King did not need the Vale today. He would have it in the end regardless. And knowing that, he spent nothing, and lost nothing, and marched on. It was this cold arithmetic that spread through John's column like a sickness. The refugees on the road heard how the Vale had shut its gate, and they understood the lesson at once, faster than any lord could have taught it to them. Every kingdom would save only itself. Every wall would be raised for its own people and no others. If the Vale, safe as it was, would not lift a finger for the realm, then what fool would stand and die in the open field for strangers? Families began to slip away from the column in the gray hours before dawn, choosing to gamble on some hidden holdfast, some forgotten hall, some rumor of safety, in a land that no longer knew the meaning of the word. The great migration that John had built began, at its edges, to fray. He felt it going. He rode the flanks harder, pulled harder at the stragglers. But a man cannot hold water in his fists, and he knew it. The Night King was defeating Westeros long before his army ever came within sight of King's Landing. He was defeating it in the hearts of the living, one refusal at a time, one closed gate at a time, dividing the realm against itself, so that it fell apart in his hands like rotten cloth. And high above the thinning column, on the back of a dragon whose wounds still wept, Daenerys watched the desertions bleed away into the hills and drew from them a single, hardening certainty. This was what division bought. This was the price of asking when one ought to command. Somewhere behind her, the veil sat safe and useless, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened even her, that only one thing could have prevented it. Not counsel, not kinship, only a throne that no lord dared refuse. What if the greatest weapon the dead possessed was not the cold, nor the numberless army, nor the blue fire of a fallen dragon, but the simple refusal of the living to believe? In King's Landing, that refusal wore a crown. Cersei Lannister sat in a city that still smelled of summer, of bread and rot and river mud. And to her, the war in the north was a story told by frightened men to excuse their failures. Stories did not take cities. Armies took cities, and armies could be counted, bribed, poisoned, or crushed against a wall. She had spent her life learning the shape of that arithmetic. It had never once failed her. So when the refugees came, she saw not an army, but a symptom. They arrived first as a trickle at the gate of the gods, then as a swelling tide pressing against the mud walls of Flea Bottom's outer sprawl, carrying children with blackened fingers and old men whose feet had frozen and split. They spoke of the dead walking. They spoke of a rider on a pale horse whose eyes burned like drowned stars. They spoke of Winterfell fallen and the Vale sealed, and the whole of the north swallowed whole. And Cersei, listening to the reports her spies brought up the Serpentine steps, heard only the sound of panic, breeding panic, the one contagion she feared above all others, because a frightened city is a city that opens its gates. "Turn them away," she said. "Those already inside, arrest." Empty gales filled quickly with men whose only crime was surviving to tell the truth. She did not want the truth. The truth was a rumor, and rumors were to be strangled in their cradles before they learned to walk through the streets and topple thrones. She reasoned it cleanly, the way she reasoned everything. If the dead were real, the city could not be saved by a mob at its gates. If the dead were not real, the mob would still tear the city apart from within. Either way, the gates stayed shut. Either way, control was the only currency that mattered, and the appearance of control was itself a kind of control, a spell that held only so long as no one dared question it. Qyburn did not share her certainty, and Qyburn was a man who had made a career of believing only what he could hold in his hands. A desperate maester had smuggled something past the guards, wrapped in oilcloth and packed in salt, a fragment of a white, a severed hand still twitching against the dead cold of it, fingers curling and uncurling with an appetite that no life could explain. Qyburn examined it in the flickering dark of his workroom beneath the Red Keep, and what he found unmade every comfortable theory he had brought to the table. The thing did not rot. It did not still. It moved by no muscle he could name, driven by no blood, no breath, no will he could dissect. He understood, with the cold thoroughness of a man who has finally met a problem larger than his intellect, that the stories were true, and he brought that understanding to his queen the way a man carries a lit torch into a room full of oil. She silenced him, not with argument, for she had no argument, but with the flat refusal of a mind that has already decided what it will permit itself to know. "If it is real," she said, "then the walls will hold." The walls had held against Stannis. The walls had held against every enemy the years had thrown against them. She trusted stone, and where stone might fail, she trusted fire. Beneath the city, In cellars and cisterns in the buried veins of forgotten passages, the caches of wildfire waited, more of them now than ever, hoarded and hidden and multiplied on her order. She had watched the sept of Baelor bloom into green flame, and she had learned a lesson from it that no one else had thought to learn, that fire did not care what it burned. Living men, dead men, it made no distinction, and so she planned to make none either. Let the dead come to her walls. She would give them a city of fire and watch it consume them all. Euron Greyjoy saw the collapse coming, the way a sailor sees weather, in the color of the sky and the wrongness of the wind. He came to her not as a supplicant, but as a gambler cashing his winnings before the table burned. "Come with me to the Iron Islands," he told her. "Take your gold, and your monster, and your unborn child, and let the mainland drown in whatever is drowning it. The sea is a wall no dead man can climb. The drowned god's country is the only country that will still be standing when this is done." He offered her survival, stripped of everything that made survival worth having to her, and in that offer she heard only weakness, only the flight of a man who did not understand what she understood, that a queen who abandons her throne has abandoned herself, that the Iron Throne was not a chair, but the whole of what she was. "I will not run," she said. He studied her with his one good humor curdling into something colder. "You will die on that ugly chair," he said, "and it will not even be a good death." "Perhaps," she answered, "but it will be mine." The alliance did not break in that moment. It merely revealed itself for what it had always been: two predators sharing a kill, each measuring the other for the day the meat ran out. Euron left her solar and went down to the harbor where his ships waited, black-sailed and ready, and he began, quietly, to make his own arrangements, to decide how much of her gold he might carry off when the carrying off began. He did not tell her this. He did not need to. She knew, and knowing, let him go, because a queen surrounded by loyal men who lie is no better served than a queen surrounded by faithless men who tell the truth. Far to the north, past the fraying edges of Jon's migration, past the neck and the trident and the empty holdfasts already going quiet with cold, the outer holdings of the crownlands felt the first breath of it. A watchman on a distant wall saw his torch flame lean sideways in a wind that came from the wrong direction, and turned to call to his fellow and found no words. What if the war could be won in a single stroke? Not by armies, not by dragons, not by the slow grinding attrition of the living against the endless dead, but by one blade, one throat, one death. This was the thought that kept two figures moving through the frozen dark, weeks behind the great host, close enough now to smell the cold that clung to it like rot. Arya Stark had learned to read an army the way she once learned to read faces. She watched the way the dead moved, the way they clustered and thinned, the way they flowed across the broken land like water finding its level. And in that flow, she had begun to see a shape, a center, a point around which the whole vast body of them turned, the way a wheel turns around its hub. She did not know yet what waited at that hub, but she suspected. She had suspected since the gods would, since the moment the blade had almost fallen and had not. The hound walked beside her, hood drawn low, saying little, which for him was much. He had come north to kill his brother and stayed, for reasons he did not examine, to follow a girl into the teeth of the world's ending. He told himself it was because there was nowhere better to go. He was lying, and some quiet part of him knew it. They found a ridge above a fallen holdfast 3 days after the ridge above the last one. Below them, the walls had been thrown down, the gate splintered, the yard littered with the men who had died defending it. And into that yard rode a figure on a horse the color of dead snow, a figure crowned in ice, moving without haste, without hunger, without anything a living creature would recognize as intent. Arya went very still. The Night King raised his arms, and the dead in the yard, the men who had fallen fighting only hours before, opened their eyes. They rose. They turned toward the north, toward the great host that waited beyond the ridgeline, and they went to join it. And the army that had been vast was now a little vaster, and the death that had come to this small place had not weakened him at all. It had fed him. That was the arithmetic. Arya understood it now with a clarity that felt almost like despair. Every man who died fighting the dead became a soldier for the dead. Every failed defense added to the strength of the thing that had broken it. You could not bleed this enemy. You could not starve him or exhaust him or wear him down. He grew from your losses. He was made of your losses. He's the center, she said quietly. All of them. The walkers, the whites, all of it. It comes from him. The hound looked down at the yard, at the risen men shuffling north. You don't know that. I do. She did. She could not have explained how, only that she had watched enough of them to feel where the strings ran, and every string ran back to the crowned figure on the pale horse. Kill him, and they fall. All of them, at once. Sandor Clegane was a man who had spent his life calculating the shortest distance between himself and survival, and he ran the numbers now with the practiced coldness of someone who had never once expected the world to be fair. To reach the Night King, you had to pass through the army, the whole of it. And the army was arranged, whether by design or by nature, so that its master sat at its very heart, wrapped in 10,000 corpses, surrounded by his lieutenants, the pale-eyed captains, who could not be killed by any ordinary steel. You can't get to him, he said. Nobody can get to him. You'd have to cut through the entire bloody host, and every one of them you kill just slows you down, while 100 more close in behind you. And if you die trying. He stopped. Then I get up and walk north with the rest of them, Arya finished. I know. That was the trap of it. The perfect, closing trap. To attempt the killing and fail was worse than not attempting at all, because failure did not merely cost you your life, it cost you your corpse, and your corpse was a weapon he would turn against everyone you had ever loved. The odds were not long. The odds did not exist. There was no plausible path from where they stood to where the crowned figure sat. No line you could draw across that map that did not pass through certain death, and then, past death, through certain betrayal of your own side. And yet, Arya kept watching the pale horse. The Night King did not gloat. He did not survey his work. He simply turned, unhurried, and rode back toward the north, and the terrible economy of him settled into her bones. One death, only one. The whole nightmare hung from a single thread, and if you could reach the thread and cut it, the entire tapestry would come apart in an instant. That was not despair. That was the opposite of despair. That was the only hope there was. The hound had already worked it through to the same place, and he hated that he had, because the conclusion required something of him he had spent his whole life refusing to give. He could leave. He could turn south right now and put this frozen madness behind him and drink himself warm in some southern hovel while the world ended somewhere over his shoulder. That was the sensible move. That had always been the sensible move. He did not make it. They have to know, he said instead, and the words came out rougher than he intended. Snow, the Dragon Queen, whatever's left of them, they're building their whole plan around holding walls and burning the buggers down as they come. And it doesn't matter. None of it matters. You could burn 100,000 of them, and he'd raise 200,000 more out of the ash. He spat into the snow. They need to stop fighting the arm and start going for the head. Arya turned to look at him, and something passed between them that neither of them named. "You're staying," she said. It was not a question. "I'm staying," he answered. And in that moment, the man who had run from every fire in his life turned deliberately and began to walk back toward the last one. What if the war had never been about walls at all? What if every stone they had stacked, every trench they had dug, every barricade they had thrown across the neck of the world was nothing more than an elaborate way of losing slowly? The survivors did not know it yet, not all of them, but they were about to, and they gathered to learn it in the one place in all of Westeros vast enough to hold their ruin. Harrenhal rose out of the plain like the corpse of some ancient god, its 5 towers half melted, its walls scorched black by a dragon 3 centuries dead. It had been built to be unconquerable. It had been broken in a single day by fire from the sky. There was, perhaps, no fitter place for what came next. The remnants of 2 armies limped into its cavernous halls, and the cold that followed them was not the honest cold of winter, but the deeper, wrongness-laced cold that trailed the dead like a scent. They lit fires in the great hearths, and the fires did not seem to warm anything. Men slept with their backs to the walls, and their swords across their knees, and the horses would not settle, and the ravens would not fly north. It was into this that Arya came, thin and hard and quieter than Jon remembered, with a broken hound-shaped shadow at her back. He did not recognize her at first across the smoke-filled hall. Then he did, and something in his chest that had been clenched for so long he had forgotten it was clenched came briefly loose. They did not speak much. They embraced, and it was the embrace of 2 people who had each expected to find the other dead, and neither of them wept, because weeping was a luxury of people who still believed the worst had already happened. But Arya had not come for comfort. She had come with a plan, and the plan reshaped everything. Consider the arithmetic that had ruled their strategy until that hour. Every calculation had assumed attrition. Hold the line, thin their numbers, retreat, hold again, buy time with distance and death. It was the arithmetic of every war that had ever been fought, and it was, against this enemy, precisely wrong. Arya laid it out in the council chamber with the cold clarity of a blade being drawn, and the truth of it settled over the assembled lords like a shroud. Kill the head, and the body falls. Every wight, every corpse soldier, every risen horror was bound to the will that raised it. Take the Night King, and the war ends in a single breath. Fail to take him, and no number of victories anywhere else would ever amount to anything but delay. They sat with it, Daenerys and Jon, Davos, whose weathered face had learned long ago to hide despair, Sam, clutching a book that suddenly seemed very small, Jaime and Brienne, side by side, 2 swords that had chosen this side of the fire when they might have fled, and Arya, who had already killed 1 god of death and did not seem to think a second beyond her. The plan that emerged was not a plan a sane commander would choose. It was the plan of people who had run out of every other option. Drogon would punch a hole. That was the phrase Davos used, and it was ugly and precise. The last dragon would burn a corridor straight through the massed dead, straight toward the Pale Rider at their heart, and through that corridor a small strike team would move, fast, quiet, expendable in the way that only the truly necessary things are expendable. Arya would lead it. Arya would carry the blade. Everything else was noise built around that single, brittle intention. They agreed because there was nothing else to agree to. But agreement is not unity, and beneath the table where the plan took shape, older calculations were already turning. John found Daenerys alone after the others had gone, in a chamber high in one of the melted towers, where the wind came through the cracked stone and made the candle flames shiver. He had carried a secret so long, it had become the shape of him, and he had decided, in the clean terror of a war he might not survive, that she deserved the truth of it, that the truth might even help. Two claims joined were stronger than two claims divided. That was the logic. That was always the logic. He told her what Sam and Bran had told him, that he was not the bastard he had believed himself to be, that his father was Rhaegar and his mother Lyanna, that a marriage had been made in secret and a birth hidden in blood, that his true name was Aegon Targaryen, and that by every law men had ever written, he stood before the Iron Throne ahead of her. He offered it as a gift. He believed it was a gift. Watch what happens on her face as the words land, because this is the fulcrum on which everything after will turn. She does not think first of family. She does not think first of the dead. She thinks of Dragonstone in the rain, and of the years in the grass, sold from tent to tent, of everything endured for the single burning conviction that she was born to save this ruined world, and to sit at its summit while she did. She thinks of the way men had looked at Jon in the hall, the way they warmed to him without effort, the way loyalty flowed to him like water finding its level, and she understands, with the swift, merciless clarity of someone who has been betrayed her whole life, that the truth Jon has just handed her is not a gift. It is a threat. Who else knows? She says. Her voice is very quiet. It is not the question of a woman receiving family. It is the question of a queen counting who must be silenced. Sam, Jon answers, not yet understanding what he has done. Bran, that's all. She turns from him toward the cracked window and the dark plain beyond, where somewhere the dead were gathering for the end of everything. She does not tell him that she loves him. She does not tell him that it changes nothing. She says nothing at all for a long moment. And in that silence, a seed took root that would outlast the war itself, that would grow in the ruin of Harrenhal, even as the greater ruin marched south to meet them. What if the last army of the living was not an army at all, but a rumor that men rode toward because they had nowhere else to ride? Consider the arithmetic of desperation. The great host that had once mustered at Winterfell was gone, swallowed by the northern dark, and what remained scattered across the riverlands like ash on wind. So the survivors did the only thing left to survivors. They sent out calls. Ravens went black into a gray sky, and riders carried folded letters south and west and to the deep red country of Dorne, each letter carrying the same impossible summons, each written in the plain language of people who no longer had time for flourishes. Come to the God's Eye. Come while there is still a living thing to come to. They came slowly, and they came few. A handful of Reach Knights, younger sons and hedge riders who had missed the wars of succession and now rode toward the only war that would ever matter. Their armor, bright and untested, and soon to be neither. The remnants of the Brotherhood without banners drifted in from the hollows and the burned villages, lean men who had spent years fighting the wrong enemy and now understood, too late, what they had been rehearsing for. Dornish outriders arrived on lathered horses from the passes, dark-eyed and wary, sent by lords who calculated that a distant death was still death and had wagered a few spears against the possibility that the North's madness might be true. 10,000 perhaps, when the counting was done. 10,000 against a number that had stopped being a number and become a tide. And here the strategy narrows to its final, brutal point. 10,000 cannot win a battle against the dead. Everyone in that muster knew it, though no one spoke it aloud in the open, because to speak it was to unmake the thing they were building. 10,000 can only do one thing. They can be a wall. They can be a body thrown across a doorway, so that a smaller, sharper thing can slip past behind them. The living were not gathering an army. They were gathering a distraction, and each man who rode into the God's Eye was, in the cold ledger of the plan, already spent. In the smoke of a hasty forge, Gendry worked the last of it. The dragon glass had grown scarce, the veins of it mined out of dragonstone and carried north, and shattered in the fall of Winterfell. And what remained, he hoarded like a miser, counting the final coins of a dead fortune. Beside it, he laid the salvaged Valyrian steel, blades stripped from the hands of the fallen, from tombs and battlefields and the corpses of lords who no longer needed them. He forged for the strike team and no one else. Not spears for the wall, not arrowheads for the doomed. Only the weapons that mattered, only the edges that could unmake the thing they meant to kill. Each strike of his hammer was a wager, placed on a plan so thin it could barely bear its own weight. And when the forging was done, Arya reclaimed the dagger. It was the same blade. That was the weight of it, the reason it made men fall silent when she took it up. Valyrian steel with a dragonbone hilt, the knife that had been sent to open a boy's throat in his sleep, the knife that had passed from assassin to Baelish to Bran, to her own hand on the night the dead came through the walls of Winterfell. She had nearly used it then, had felt its balance, had known its purpose, had been caught before the killing blow could land. Now she took it back, and the taking felt less like arming herself and more like keeping an appointment long deferred. The plan turned on this, a small thing, a quiet thing, slipping through the gap the 10,000 would tear open with their bodies. She did not speak of it. She did not need to. The blade said everything the plan required. But the plan was not the only mind at work in those days, and the most dangerous mind belonged to the queen, with no more dragons to lose than the two she had left. What if desperation, in a certain kind of ruler, does not counsel caution, but cruelty? What if the logic runs the other way entirely, so that the more one has lost, the more one is willing to burn? Daenerys made her decision alone. She did not summon a council. She did not seek Jon's counsel, or Tyrion's, or the grim assent of the northern lords. She looked at the map of the Riverlands, and she saw a truth that the tacticians had circled, but not dared to name aloud. The dead did not merely march. They harvested. Every village they passed, every straggler, every family too slow or too stubborn to flee, became a soldier in the enemy's ranks. The land itself was feeding the tide, so she would deny it the food. Drogon rose in the gray dawn and put fire to a swath of the Riverlands, a broad black scar of it, farms and fields and the huddled remnants of hamlets that had not emptied fast enough. She burned the dead where they might rise, and she burned the living who had not yet run. From the ground it was a wall of flame walking across the world, indifferent to who stood in its path, and when it passed, there was nothing left for the Night King to raise but ash, and nothing left for the small folk who had sheltered there but the same. Jon saw the smoke before he understood it, and when he understood it, something in him went very cold and very still. He rode to her. He did not shout. That was not his way, and shouting would have been an admission that words could still reach her. He asked her, quietly, whether she knew that living men had been in those fields, and she looked at him with her chin lifted and her eyes bright, and answered that she knew, and that it changed nothing, because the dead would have taken them regardless, and better ash than another spear in the enemy's hand. He does not answer. He looks at the smoke instead, at the horizon gone black where fields had been, and he understands something he cannot yet put into words, that the war against the dead was teaching the living to think like the dead, that she had crossed a line and would cross others, and that each crossing would come easier than the last. Behind them, to the north, the tide came on. What if a battle could be planned like a wager, every piece placed with cold precision, every life on the board assigned a value before a single blade was drawn? The living had come at last to the shores of the God's Eye, that vast gray mirror of a lake at the heart of the realm, and there they arranged themselves, not as a host, but as a mechanism. The water was their ally now. Though water had never fought a war, it could not be raised. It could not be crossed by a shambling column of the drowned dead, who did not know how to swim so much as sink. And so the strategists among the living, what few remained who could still think past their own exhaustion, anchored the whole formation upon that shore, letting the lake guard their left flank the way a wall guards a keep. One side made safe by nature, the other side to be made safe by fire. That was the whole of the design, reduced to its bones. Hold the line with dragon flame, wait for the corridor, send the blade. The dead came as they always came, without hurry and without hesitation, in numbers that made the ground itself seem to move. And the living met them at the water's edge with pikes braced and torches lifted, and above them Daenerys wheeled Drogon low across the front, and the dragon opened its throat and painted the night orange. Understand what that fire meant in the arithmetic of that hour. Every white it burned was a white that could not be raised again, and every gap it carved was a gap the Night King had to fill from his reserves. And his reserves, vast as they were not infinite. The living were counting. That was the terrible truth beneath the roar of the flames. Somewhere behind that line, a girl with a Valyrian blade was counting too, waiting for the moment the fire cut deep enough toward the center, waiting for the corridor that Drogon would carve straight toward the pale figure sitting motionless upon his dead mount at the heart of the enemy host. And Drogon carved it. The dragon dove, and the fire came down in a long burning furrow through the press of the dead. And for one breath, for one impossible breath, there was a road of ash and smoke and dying blue light, leading from the shore toward the place where the Night King waited. Arya moved before the others had fully seen it. That was her nature. She did not wait to be certain. She waited only to be moving. Behind her came the Hound, and Brienne, and Jaime, 4 figures sprinting into a gap that was already beginning to close behind them. The plan was simple, which is to say it was fragile, because simple plans depend on timing, and timing depends on things no strategist can command. The corridor was a promise the fire could not keep. Even as they ran, the dead were flooding back into the furrow from either side, drawn toward the living, the way water fills a footprint pressed into wet sand. The Hound understood this first. He always understood the moment before it arrived, because fear had taught him to read the shape of ruin. A wave of whites broke inward across their path, and someone had to hold them, and holding them meant staying, and staying meant dying. He did not deliberate. He turned, and he set his feet, and he told the girl to run, and he meant it in a way he had never quite meant anything before. Consider what fire had done to him across a lifetime. Consider how a burned man might spend his whole life bargaining with the thing that scarred him. And now he stood in a corridor of dragon flame with the dead pouring toward him, and he did not flinch from it. The fear he had carried since boyhood simply left him, quietly, the way a fever breaks. He was not afraid. That was his final and greatest astonishment. He swung until the numbers took him, and he went down beneath them without a sound worth remembering. And behind him, the girl kept moving, which was the only monument he had ever wanted. But the corridor collapsed too soon. This is the flaw in every plan built upon fire. Fire is a variable, not a constant. Drogon could not hold the furrow open forever, could not be everywhere, and when the dragon rose to answer a fresh threat upon the shore, the flames guttered, and the dead surged into the gap, and the strike team, 4 reduced already to 3, was broken apart in the dark. Brienne took a spear along her side and staggered, and the wound was not mortal, but it was slowing, and slowing in that place was the same as mortal by another name. Jaime did what a lifetime of cynicism had somehow failed to burn out of him. He turned back for her. He set himself between her body and the dead, and he fought with the ruin of a swordsman who had once been the best in the realm, and it was enough for a moment, and a moment was all he had. The whites took him by the arms and the legs and the throat and dragged him down into the press, still swinging, still shouting her name, and Brienne could not reach him. The tide closed over the place where he had stood. And so the whole design, the whole vast calculated wager of the living, came at last to rest upon a single point. One girl, one blade. Everyone else was fallen or scattered or fighting for their own lives in the dark. And the corridor was gone, and the fire had moved on, and Arya stood alone in the smoke with the Night King within sight before her. He had not moved. He sat his dead horse at the center of everything, watching the destruction of the plan he could not have known existed, and he did not yet understand that the plan had never depended on the corridor. It had depended on her reaching this place, by any road, at any cost. And she had reached it, bloodied and alone, and grieving men she had no time to grieve. She had reached it. The whole war narrowed now to the distance between her feet and his, a distance measured in bodies, and she began, very quietly, to close it. What if the second chance had always been an illusion? What if the plan the living had built, layer upon layer, sacrifice upon sacrifice, had rested on an assumption that no longer held true, that the enemy at the God's Eye was the same enemy who had ridden into Winterfell? He was not. That is the calculation Arya did not have, could not have, as she moved through the smoke toward the still figure at the center of the field. She was betting on a past that had already ended. She closed the distance the way she had always closed distance. Low, quiet, angled, her body turned to present the smallest target, the Valyrian dagger reversed along her forearm where it would not catch the light. Every man she had killed had learned nothing from her, because every man she had killed had died. That was the terrible efficiency of her art. No one survived to study her. No one lived to warn the next. But he had not died, and he had studied. Consider the difference. In Winterfell, she had come at him from above and behind, unseen, and the first he had known of her was her weight against his throat. There had been no exchange, no reading, no adjustment. This time, he watched her come. He watched her from the moment she stepped clear of the burning line, and in the watching, he was already solving her, the way a man solves a problem he has seen the shape of once before and sworn never to be surprised by again. She sprang. It was beautiful, that leap. There is no other word for it, though beauty is a strange thing to find on that ruined field. She sprang, and the dagger came up in her right hand toward the pale flesh of his throat, exactly where it had gone before, exactly where it needed to go. His hand closed on her wrist in the air. Not a block, not a parry, a catch, precise and unhurried, the fingers finding the joint as though he had rehearsed the motion in the long silence of his march. And here is the moment on which the whole war turned. Here is where she reached, as she had always been able to reach, for the second option, the drop, the switch, the dagger falling from the caught hand into the free one, the feint that had undone the trap at Winterfell, that had let her survive her own certain death by turning her weakness into a hidden edge. She dropped the blade. Her left hand rose to receive it. He knew that too. His grip tightened on the wrist he already held, and the bones gave. Not slowly. All at once, a sound beneath the roar of the field that only she could hear, the wet collapse of a joint crushed past use, and the pain took the strength from both her hands at once. The dagger fell past her open fingers. It did not land in her palm. It landed in the snow, and the snow took it, folded over it, swallowed the one weapon on the field that could have ended everything. Then he threw her. A flick of the arm, contemptuous in its economy, and she went spinning through the smoke to land broken-wristed and empty-handed in the drifts, alive only because he did not think her worth the second gesture of killing. That was the deepest cut of all. He had learned her, answered her, and dismissed her in the span of 3 heartbeats. Above the field, Daenerys saw the girl fall and understood, in the cold, clear way that terror sometimes grants, that the plan was dead. And so she reached for the only thing she had left: fire, the oldest answer her house had ever given to any question. She turned Drogon in a tight, screaming arc and brought him down upon the Night King with all the black weight of him, and she gave the word, and the world became flame. It poured over him. It washed the ice and the dead horse and the frozen ground in a river of dragon fire hot enough to melt stone. And Daenerys watched and hoped and waited for the pale figure to blacken and fall. He walked out of it, unmarked. His skin did not char, and his crown did not run, and the frost on his shoulders did not so much as steam. He walked out of the fire the way a man walks out of morning mist, and he lifted his eyes to the dragon that had failed to burn him, and something in that upward look was almost patient. And she had committed too far. That is the thing about fire as an answer. It demands nearness. To bathe him in it, she had brought Drogon low and slow and level, straight down the throat of the field, and in doing so, she had put her dragon directly into the path of another. Viserion rose from the far edge of the smoke, wings ragged, one of them half frozen and stiff from the wounds of the corridor, crippled and grounded near, but not dead, and never harmless. He climbed just high enough. He opened his broken jaw, and the blue came. It caught Drogon along the flank and the base of the wing, and the last dragon of the living screamed a sound that no living thing should make, a sound of ice invading fire, and he fell out of the sky in a long, sick spiral with Daenerys clinging to his neck. He struck the earth beyond the tree line and did not rise. He lived, but he did not rise, and grounded, he was worth nothing, and she was worth nothing beside him, and the sky over the God's Eye belonged now to the dead. That was the end of the strike team. Everyone who had been thrown at that single point, the swordsman, the corridor, the girl, the fire, all of it spent, all of it answered, all of it lying broken in the snow. The line, which had held only because it believed the killing blow was coming, felt the blow fail and broke like ice on a spring lake. The living ran. There is no gentler word. They ran from the God's Eye in every direction, leaderless and stunned, having gambled their finest and lost. And behind them, the Night King turned his dead horse south and set it walking, unhurried, toward the last road, the one that ran unbroken now all the way to the walls of King's Landing, where no army waited that could stand in his way. What happens to a fellowship when it survives the thing it was built to prevent? What happens to allies when the alliance itself has failed? They gathered in a half-ruined holdfast a day's ride south of the God's Eye, the shattered remnants of a coalition that had once believed it could hold the whole of Westeros together against the dead. Now it held nothing. Now it barely held itself. The fire was low, and the wine was thin, and the wounded moaned in the next room, and around a scarred table sat men and women who had been thrown together by desperation and were now being pulled apart by grief. This is the thing that catastrophe does. It does not merely kill. It divides the living against one another, sets every survivor searching for the name of the person who might have prevented the loss, and in that search, it finishes the work the enemy began. Jon Snow began it, though he did not mean to begin anything. He spoke of the Riverlands. He spoke of the villages burned to deny the dead their fuel, the small folk driven onto the roads without shelter as winter deepened, the choices made without counsel and without warning. He did not raise his voice. That was somehow worse. A raised voice can be forgiven as passion. A quiet accusation is a verdict. Daenerys heard the verdict and answered with one of her own. She spoke of the North's endless divisions, the lords who had bickered over precedence while the dead marched, the Karstarks and the Umbers, and the houses that could not decide whether they served a king or a queen or nothing at all. And she spoke of Jon himself, the claim he would not press, the crown he would not take, the name he would not use. Consider the arithmetic she laid out across that table, cold and exact. A realm divided against a single enemy loses. It had lost, and it had lost because no single crown had ever sat upon a single head to which every sword answered without question. She had offered to be that crown. He had refused to let her, and he had refused, equally, to be it himself. What good is a claim, she asked, that its holder is too proud or too frightened to use? He did not answer. He looked at the fire. The silence between them was the silence of a marriage that has become a border war. And into that silence came Samwell Tarly, who had no claim to anything, who was not a strategist, who spent his hours in the next room binding wounds that would not heal. He had a different arithmetic. He set it down gently, the way he set down everything, but there was iron beneath the gentleness now. The war for Westeros, he told them, was likely over. Not the fighting, the war. The question of whether the living could hold the land itself had been answered at the God's Eye, and the answer was no. So the question had changed. The question was no longer how to win. The question was what to save. He named the things. He named them the way a man names the dying, so that they will not be forgotten. The books in the Citadel, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years of maesters, the craftsmen who knew how to forge steel and set stone and heal the sick, the children, above all the children, because a people that loses its children loses its future, even if every soldier survives. Ships waited in the southern harbors. The narrow sea was wide, and the dead did not swim. Essos was vast. If Westeros must fall, then let Westeros be the ground that is surrendered, and let the people who make a civilization be carried across the water to build it again somewhere the cold could not reach. It divided them instantly, and the division cut clean through every other quarrel. There were those who heard in Sam's words a betrayal, an abandonment of the ancestral ground, a coward's arithmetic that would see the North empty and the dead triumphant. To flee, they said, is to lose everything that made fleeing worth surviving for. And there were those who heard in his words the only sane counsel left, the only path that ended in anything but a kingdom of corpses. Fight to the last, one faction said. "Ensure that some of us live," said the other, "and these are not the same thing, and they cannot both be pursued with the same resources. And every ship loaded with children is a ship not loaded with soldiers, and every soldier held back to fight is a life that will not cross the sea." Through all of it, one figure said nothing. Arya Stark sat apart, her sword arm shattered and splinted against her chest, her face emptied of the thing that had always filled it. The Hound was dead. She had watched him die, and she had failed at the one task the whole war had been building toward since Bran had handed her its meaning without words. And the failure sat in her like a stone she could not swallow and could not spit out. But listen to what she does not do. She does not weep. She does not argue about ships. She rises, and she walks to the table, and she waits until the quarreling exhausts itself against her silence, and then she speaks. "The Night King is not invincible," she says. "He can die. Bran was right about that, even if Bran was wrong about the moment. The blow failed because it was thrown too soon, into too many defenders, with too much warning. But the dead march now toward a single place, King's Landing. And at King's Landing, the Night King will do what he has done at every wall he has broken. He will come forward. He will come to the killing, because the killing is what he is. And in the chaos of a city falling, in the press and the smoke and the screaming, a single blade might reach a place that 10,000 blades could not reach in open snow." She looks around the table at the broken fellowship, at the king who will not be king, and the queen with no armies, and the fat man counting children onto ships, and she asks for none of them. She asks only for a few, a small band, people who have nothing left to lose and one thing left to do. Some hands, around that low and failing fire, begin to rise. What if the highest walls in the world are only as strong as the ground beneath them? King's Landing had never been taken by storm. The Blackwater had turned back a claimant. The Targaryens had held it for 3 centuries behind stone, laid deep and thick, curtain upon curtain, gates banded in iron thick as a man's arm. And so when the first outriders of the dead appeared on the plain beyond the northern gate, moving without banners, without drums, without the ragged noise that living armies make, the men upon the battlements looked down and felt, for a single treacherous moment, something close to safety. Stone had held before. Stone would hold again. They told themselves this the way frightened men tell themselves anything. Cersei watched from the Red Keep. She had summoned the Golden Company across the sea for exactly this. 20,000 sellswords who had never broken a contract, and she placed them upon the walls beside the gold cloaks of the city watch. She had gold enough to feed them, wildfire enough to end them if they wavered, and a certainty, born of a lifetime of winning, that the world would arrange itself around her survival. She had faced fleets and rivals and prophecies. She did not intend to lose to weather. The first assault came at the northern wall, and the first assault failed. This is the detail worth holding, because it is the detail that doomed the city. The dead who came against the stone came without ladders, without towers, without engines, and they died again in their thousands at the foot of the walls that they could not climb. Golden Company crossbows loosed until their arms ached. The dead fell and did not rise, because their strings had been cut, because a body, pinned beneath 100 other bodies, cannot answer any call. And along the battlements, a cheer went up, thin and disbelieving, the sound of men who had been promised the end of the world, discovering that the world was still standing. The Night King let them cheer. He was not besieging the walls. He never had been. A wall is a problem of the outside, and the Night King's power had never respected the difference between outside and inside. He had raised the fallen of Winterfell where they lay. He had raised the drowned and the frozen along the length of the march. And King's Landing, the largest city in Westeros, the city that had swelled with 100,000 refugees, fleeing the very army now at its gates, was built upon its own dead, centuries of dead. The recent dead of famine and plague in the crowded streets, the refugees who had already died of cold and hunger in the sprawl beyond the walls, unburied, uncounted, lying in the ditches and the alleys and the shallow graves of Flea Bottom. He raised them all. They rose inside the walls. That is the horror of it, and the strategic elegance of it, and the reason no height of stone could have saved the city. The defenders were facing outward, loosing their bolts at the tide beyond the gate, when behind them, the ground of the outer city began to move. The dead came up through the graveyards and the cellars and the paupers' pits. They came up in the markets and the tanneries and the beggars' streets, and the living, who had crowded into King's Landing, seeking the safety of walls, found themselves sealed inside a slaughterhouse, with the walls doing exactly what walls do, which is to keep everyone inside from getting out. The outer city collapsed in a single night. There is no other way to describe the speed of it. 250,000 souls, packed shoulder to shoulder, and every corpse a new soldier the instant it fell. The Golden Company on the walls turned to find the killing already behind them, already among the streets they had been paid to protect. And the discipline that had never broken a contract broke against a thing that could not be bargained with. Some fought, most died. The dead they made rose up beside the dead who had raised them. And Euron Greyjoy, watching from the vantage of the Red Keep's lower yards, made the only calculation that had ever mattered to him. He had come for a queen and a crown, and the pleasure of taking what other men wanted. He had never come to die for stone. He understood, faster than the sellswords, faster than the gold cloaks, faster perhaps than Cersei herself, that a city rising from within cannot be defended, and that a man with ships has no business dying in a city. His fleet lay in Blackwater Bay, the Iron Fleet, the greatest naval power left in the world, and it answered to him and to no one else. Cersei had loaded the ships with gold to pay the Golden Company. The gold was already aboard. He does not go to her. This is worth noting, because a lesser villain might have gone to her, might have offered a berth, might have tried to carry the queen away and rule beside her from some distant shore. Euron does not. He takes as many ships as he can, crew from the men fleeing the docks, and he takes the gold, and he leaves the queen upon her hill. He does not send word. He does not finish the sentence of their alliance. He does not need to. He simply sails. And with him goes the last road out of King's Landing. Cersei had built her survival on two things: on the walls, which were now failing, and on the fleet, which was now leaving the bay under another man's hand, dark sails against a burning shore. She stood in the Red Keep and understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she had been outmaneuvered by a thing that did not scheme, and abandoned by a man who had never intended to stay. Beneath her feet, in the tunnels and the cellars her father's father had never spoken of, sat the caches of wildfire that the Mad King had buried under the city. Enough to burn King's Landing to its foundations, enough to take the dead and the living and the stone itself and turn it all to green flame. She had known of them for years. She had never dared to use them. Now the dead were in the streets, the fleet was on the water, and the queen, with no armies, stood alone above a city built on fire, and began, at last, to consider the one weapon she had always kept and never spent. What if the last weapon a queen possesses is the one that destroys everything she meant to protect? What if the only way to win is to ensure there is nothing left to rule? Cersei Lannister had spent her whole life measuring victory in what she held: the crown, the city, the living memory of a family name. And now, standing in the highest chamber of a keep that trembled with the sound of the dead against its gates, she weighed all of it against the thing she had always feared to spend. She gave the order in a voice that did not shake. That was the strange part, the part that even she noticed in some distant, watching corner of her mind. She had expected to falter. She did not falter. She spoke the words, and a man went down into the tunnels with a torch, and the queen of a dying city stood at her window and waited to see if fire could do what walls and men and dragons had failed to do. The wildfire had waited under King's Landing for 2 decades, buried by a mad king who had dreamed of the same thing she now attempted, the same last mercy dressed as vengeance. It had sat in its clay pots beneath the streets, beneath the taverns and the temples, and the beds of sleeping children, patient as any buried thing. And when the torch touched it, the whole undercity of the capital woke at once. The green came first through the sept, then through the alleys of Flea Bottom, then through the wide avenues where the dead were thickest. It did not burn as ordinary fire burns. It climbed. It leapt from stone to stone, as though it were alive and hunting, and it swallowed whole districts in the time it took a man to draw breath and understand that he was already gone. Thousands of wights caught in the flood of emerald flame, their dry flesh flaring, their ancient bones cracking, their forms collapsing into ash that the wind carried up into a sky already thick with smoke. For a moment, watching from her window, Cersei believed she had done it. For a moment, the calculus balanced. The dead were burning. The tide that had crossed a continent and toppled her every defense was, at last, meeting something it could not simply walk through. But the dead do not fear fire the way the living do, and there were more of them than there was flame. The wights that burned were replaced by the wights behind them, and behind those, more still, an army that did not thin because it did not know how to be afraid. The green fire consumed the front ranks, and the ranks behind pressed forward over the ash, indifferent, obedient to a will that watched all of this without concern. Wildfire could kill the risen dead by the 1,000. It could not kill them by the 100,000, and it could not touch the ones who mattered. The White Walkers walked through the flames untouched. This was the miscalculation at the heart of Cersei's last gamble, the flaw she could not have known because no living scholar had ever tested it. Fire was the answer to the wights, the shambling corpses, the fuel of the army. It was no answer at all to the makers of that army. The cold that lived in the White Walkers was older than any flame Aegon or any alchemist had ever conjured, and the green fire that turned stone to slag parted around them like water around a rock in a river. The Night King came up through the burning city. He did not hurry. He never hurried. He moved through streets of emerald flame with the same measured patience he had shown crossing the Neck, crossing the Trident, crossing every field where men had thought to stop him and failed. The fire lit the crown of ice upon his brow. It cast his shadow long against the walls of collapsing houses, and it did not so much as slow his stride toward the Red Keep, where the last living queen of Westeros stood and understood, finally and completely, that her weapon had failed. Below her, the tunnels she had meant as her own escape had become her tomb. The wildfire she had loosed did not distinguish between the dead in the streets and the queen in the keep. As the flames spread beneath the foundations, the ancient stone began to give, and the passages her family had dug in secret over centuries buckled and fell. Cersei Lannister, who who had schemed her way to a throne over the bodies of everyone who stood between her and it, died beneath the weight of the city she had ruled, crushed in the dark by the collapse of the very tunnels she had trusted to save her. There was no crowd to see it, no enemy to savor it. She died alone, in the dark, unwatched, which was perhaps the only ending she would have refused to choose for herself. Above the ruin, the Red Keep burned, and through its gates, up its crumbling stairs, into the great hall where 100 lords had once knelt, the Night King walked. The roof was open to the sky now, rafters gone to ash, and green fire licked at the edges of the chamber where kings and queens had held their court for 300 years. At the center of it, warped by the heat but still standing, sat the Iron Throne. 1,000 swords, forged in dragonfire, surrendered by the beaten enemies of the first Targaryen king. The physical center of Westerosi power. The seat every war on the continent had been fought to claim. The Night King crossed the burning hall. He ascended the dais, and he sat. He sat upon the throne of Aegon the Conqueror, the melted blades of 1,000 fallen kings beneath him, the capital burning around him, and every kingdom of the living now leaderless and open before him. There was no ceremony to it, no triumph in his pale, still face. It was simply the next thing, the logical conclusion of a march that had begun beyond a wall, raised against exactly this, and had ended here, on the highest seat in the realm, claimed at last by death itself. The fire crackled, the stone groaned, and in the far chambers of the burning keep, somewhere below, something the Night King had not yet accounted for, stirred in the smoke and began to move. What if a realm could die, not in a single battle, but in the slow, quiet exhale that follows one? What if the fall of a capital was not the end of a war, but merely the moment the survivors understood there was no war left to fight? The news traveled faster than the dead ever could. It moved along the King's Road in the mouths of fleeing men, in the panicked reports of riders who had seen the sky above King's Landing turn black with smoke, and colder still with something that had no name in any living tongue. The city had fallen, the throne was taken, and the lords of the South, who had spent their whole lives calculating which side to bow to, discovered that there was no longer a side to choose. There was only surrender, and surrender to the dead was not a bargain, it was an ending. Consider what happens to a realm when its center is removed. The great houses of Westeros had always been held together by a single fixed point, a seat that gave meaning to every alliance and every rebellion. Remove that point, and the structure does not merely weaken, it ceases to exist. Highgarden's remaining garrison, hearing that no relief would ever come, that no crown remained to rally to, simply opened its gates to the cold and was gone by morning. Old Town, city of scholars and maesters, saw its towers go dark one by one. In Dorne, where men had defied every conqueror who ever crossed the Prince's Pass, the sand and the sun offered no defense against a thing that did not need to breathe, did not need to drink, did not tire beneath any heat the desert could summon. The holdfasts fell not in grand sieges but in silences, each one a candle snuffed, each one a place where the living had been and now were not. There was no central resistance to blunt the spread. That was the whole of it. A single army of the dead, marching from a single throne, needed only to move outward in every direction, and there was nothing standing in the road to slow it. What had taken the living centuries to build, the dead unmade in a season. At the coast, on a gray shingle beach beneath a sky the color of ash, the last of the living gathered. A few thousand souls. That was the accounting now. Not the strength of a kingdom, not the muster of the North, not the horde that had ridden south behind 2 dragons and a dream of a united realm. A few thousand, soldiers who had run out of ground to hold, small folk who had run out of places to run, and at their head, the survivors of every plan that had failed, Jon, who had spent his whole life fighting this enemy and had lost, Daenerys, who had crossed the world to claim a throne that now belonged to death, Sam, who had read the histories that were ending, Arya, who had killed the enemy's champion once and watched it change nothing in the end, Davos, who had smuggled and served and outlived so many better men, and who now stood counting ships the way he had once counted coin. The ships, that was the calculation that mattered. Davos knew it before any of them, because Davos had always understood that survival was a matter of vessels and tides, and how many bodies you could fit in a hold before it stopped being a rescue and became a coffin. He walked the beach and did his sums. There were not enough ships for a kingdom. There were enough ships for this, for what remained, for the few thousand who had made it to the water. And beyond the water lay the only future left, across the narrow sea. The free cities, with their walls and their sellswords and their squabbling magisters who did not yet know that the world they bickered over was already smaller than it had been. Braavos, Pentos, Volantis, Meereen, far to the east, where a queen had once broken chains and learned to rule. That was the map now. Not Westeros. Westeros was a graveyard, a continent handed to the cold. The living would build elsewhere, or they would not build at all. Daenerys stood apart from the others, at the edge of the shingle, where the waves came in and drew back, and she looked west. Not at the ships, at the land behind them, at the ruin of everything she had crossed an ocean to claim. Somewhere beyond the horizon, on a throne of melted swords, her enemy sat in the seat that had belonged to her blood for 300 years, the Iron Throne. The whole of her life had been an arrow aimed at that single point, and the point was gone, taken by a thing that felt no triumph in the taking. Watch the thought move through her. It is not grief, though grief is in it. It is not rage, though rage has always been close beneath her skin. It is calculation of the coldest and clearest kind, the sort that only comes when every other option has been stripped away and a single path remains. If Westeros cannot be saved, then Westeros is not the thing to be saved. The realm was never the point. The people were the point. The living were the point. And the living could be carried across the sea and set down on new ground and made to grow again, if someone would only take up the burden of leading them there. She would be that someone. She decided it there, on the beach, with the ash falling and the tide pulling at her boots. Not queen of a throne that no longer existed. Something older and harder than that. The one who would carry the last of the living into exile and refuse to let them die. Exile was the price. She accepted it the way she had accepted every price before it, fully, without flinching, as a bargain already struck. She turned to give the order to board. And it was then, as she opened her mouth to speak, that a sound came from the far end of the beach, a stir among the men nearest the tree line, a ripple of movement, hands reaching for swords. Something was coming out of the smoke that hung over the land behind them, something moving toward the ships. And it was not dead. The figure that emerged from the smoke was a man, and the man was Samwell Tarly, and in his arms he carried something wrapped in oilcloth and bound with cord, held against his chest the way a mother holds a child. He was breathing hard. His robes were burned at the hem. Behind him came a scattering of maesters, gray men gone grayer with ash, the last salvage of the Citadel's flight south. and they carried between them chests of books, the accumulated memory of a civilization that had already ended everywhere but in these pages. Sam did not stop until he reached her. He could not speak for a moment. And when he did speak, the words came out wrong-ordered, tumbling, a scholar's excitement warring with a scholar's exhaustion. What if the thing that made him could also end him? That was the question buried in the oilcloth. That was the question Sam had carried across a burning continent. He unwrapped the bundle with hands that shook, and what lay inside was not a weapon, but a scroll, cracked and water-stained, its ink faded to the color of old blood. An account, he explained, written by a maester long dead, copied from a source older still, describing a thing the children of the forest had done at the dawn of the world. They had taken a man. They had driven dragonglass into his heart, and the dragonglass had not killed him, but transformed him, remade him, forged him into the first of the White Walkers, the creature they now called the Night King. The children had made a weapon and lost control of it. That was the old story. But the scroll said something more, something the maester who copied it had underlined twice with a trembling stroke of the quill. The forging could be reversed. The same dragonglass that made him could unmake him if it were driven back into the heart from which it had first been drawn. Daenerys looked at the scroll. She could not read the ancient script, but she could read Sam's face. And Sam's face was the face of a man who has found a single loose stone in an impregnable wall. The heart, not the body. The body was already dead, already ice, already beyond the reach of ordinary killing. The heart, where it had all begun. Arya was there. She had come down to the beach in the confusion, silent as always, and she stood at the edge of the gathering and listened, and while the others spoke of hope and salvation and the mercy of the gods, Arya thought about a room. She thought about geometry. She thought about the throne. "He is not moving," she said. They turned to her. She did not raise her voice. "For months he has marched. He has driven the dead south in a wave, and now the wave has crested and broken over King's Landing, and he has stopped. He sits. He sits on the Iron Throne in a hall full of his own dead, and the dead do not need to eat and do not need to sleep and do not need to march. And so he does nothing. He consolidates. He waits. And a thing that waits," she said, "is a thing that has stopped watching the horizon. A thing that has stopped moving is a thing that can be reached." She let that settle. She had learned the value of silence in a hall of murderers, and she deployed it now the way a swordsman deploys the space between strikes. "The dagger," she said, "the Valyrian steel that took him once already, before all of this, before Winterfell fell and the world turned. It is in my hand. It has been in my hand this whole time. What was needed was never a bigger army. What was needed was one blade, one heart, and one person close enough to bring the two together." Jon understood first, because Jon had stood at the base of a weirwood tree and watched her do the impossible once before. He understood that she was proposing to walk into the throne room of the dead. He understood that no diversion of armies could clear a path to that room, that the dead were too many, that they would have to be drawn away rather than fought through. He understood that this was not a battle plan. It was an assassination. Daenerys understood second, and what she understood was the part that only she could provide. Drogon. The dragon had been dying by the harbor for days, wings torn, scales blackened, breathing in ragged pulls that sounded like the tide dragging over stones. But dying was not dead. Drogon could fly, perhaps once, perhaps for a single crossing of the ruined city, if the wind favored them, and the storm gave them cover. And storms were coming. The season was turning. She had felt it in the change of the air on the beach, the pressure building out over the water. They arranged it there, on the sand, in the falling ash. 3 people who had lost everything, deciding how to spend the little they had left. Drogon would carry the strike team over the corpse of King's Landing under the belly of the storm, using thunder to mask the beat of his wings, using rain to blind the sentries of the dead. Arya would go, because only Arya could. The dagger would go with her, and to buy her the one thing she needed, which was a throne room emptied of its guardians, the living would stage a landing at the harbor, loud, reckless. A feint dressed as a last desperate assault, ships driven onto the rocks, torches lit, horns blown, everything designed to shriek to the Night King that his enemies had come at last by the obvious road. The dead would flood toward the water, and while they flooded, one small figure would descend from the storm behind them, into the empty hall, toward the frozen king upon his iron seat. It was a gambit. It was the last gambit. It required the diversion to hold long enough, and the dragon to fly far enough, and the girl to move fast enough, and all 3 of these things were unlikely, and the failure of any one of them meant the failure of all. Jon looked at his sister. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke of the odds, because the odds had stopped mattering somewhere north of here, in the snow, a lifetime ago. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder. And Arya, who did not weep and did not embrace, allowed it for one moment before she turned to look toward the smoke that hid the city where the throne was waiting. What if the last battle of the living was not won by the sword that everyone watched, but by the shadow no one saw? What if victory, in the end, belonged not to strength, but to misdirection, to sacrifice, to the willingness of one man to become the noise that hid the silence beneath it? Drogon fell out of the smoke like a black stone hurled by a vengeful god. Below him lay the ruin of the Red Keep, its towers cracked open, its stones scorched, the great red walls gone gray with ash and older fire. The dragon struck the ground amid the burnt bones of the fortress, wings folding, and from his back the strike team dropped into the char and the cold. Jon came down first, sword already drawn, and the dead were already there. They came out of the rubble the way water finds a crack, pouring from every shattered archway, and Jon moved through them, not with grace, but with grim, relentless purpose, because purpose was all that remained to him. Above him, the sky turned to war. Daenerys took Drogon up into the ash, and out of the poisoned clouds came the pale horror that had once been Viserion, blue fire spilling from its ruined throat, its eyes the color of drowned stars. The 2 dragons met with a sound like mountains breaking. They twisted through the smoke, one black and living, one gray and dead, and the city below shuddered under the passing of their shadows. Daenerys had lost this child once already, in the snow, in the lake, and she did not look away from him now. She only tightened her grip and spoke the word that turned the world to flame. Jon fought toward the throne room. Each step cost him. The dead did not tire and did not fear and did not fall back, and he was only a man, and men grow weary, and men bleed. But he had a purpose, and the purpose carried him past his own exhaustion, through the great doors that hung from their hinges, into the hall where the Iron Throne sat half-melted and jagged against the far wall, and there, upon the shattered seat, stood the Night King. He turned, he saw Jon, and something almost like recognition passed across that ancient, patient face, because they had stood like this before, in a godswood, in the dark, and the memory of that near thing lived in both of them. Jon charged. It was not a plan. It was a distraction, wearing the clothing of an attack. He knew he could not win. He had always known. But he needed seconds. Only seconds. And he was willing to spend everything he had to buy them. The Night King did not repeat his old mistake. He did not stand and wait for the killing blow to be turned aside. He raised one hand, and the air itself became a fist, and Jon was hurled the length of the hall, crashing into stone, sword spinning from his grip. He struck the ground hard. He did not rise quickly. And the Night King, believing the last threat spent, believing the last living king broken upon the floor, turned back toward the throne he had crossed a continent to claim. That was the opening, not one he repeated, one that Jon created, with his body, with his fall, with the certainty of his own defeat offered up as bait. Arya came through the drifting ash. She had descended behind them all, small and silent, unseen, because she had made herself unseen her whole life, in Braavos, in the house of black and white, in the long dark years of becoming no one. She was no one now. She was only a girl with a dagger, moving across the ruined floor while the king's back was turned, while his eyes were fixed on the throne, while the whole world held its breath. The Valyrian steel was in her hand. Her feet made no sound. She was the last card in a game that had been losing for 1,000 miles. She drove the dagger into his heart. For a moment, nothing happened. The Night King went still. His head turned, slowly, and he looked down at the small hand pressed against his chest, at the blade buried in the ice of him, and there was no fear in his ancient eyes, only a vast and final surprise. He had crossed the wall. He had broken the north. He had burned his way to the seat of kings, and he was ended, in the end, by a girl he never saw, in a hall full of ash, in a silence that was about to swallow the world. He shattered. He broke apart the way a frozen lake breaks under spring, the way glass breaks, the way winter itself might break if winter could be killed. Shards of ice scattered across the throne room floor, and where the Night King had stood, there was nothing, only cold air and the drifting motes of him settling into the ash. And then the wave went out. It rippled outward from that hall, invisible and absolute, racing across the ruined city and beyond it, across the burned fields and the frozen roads, across all the long miles of Westeros the dead had marched. Every white in every street stopped. Every White Walker that had ridden south, every fallen man and woman and child, raised up in the service of the long night. In a single instant, as one, they collapsed. The strings that held them were cut, and they fell, bone and rot and rusted armor, into lifeless heaps upon the ground they had conquered. Above the city, Viserion fell too. The blue fire died in its throat mid-breath. The pale wings went slack, and the great dead dragon dropped from the sky like a stone, tumbling down through the ash toward the broken towers below, and Drogon banked away from the falling ruin of his brother and let it pass into the dark. Then there was silence, absolute, sudden, total, a silence such as the world had not known in years, a silence that fell over the whole of the continent at once, from the shattered wall in the far north to the smoking stones of King's Landing. The War of the Dead was over, and in the throne room, amid the settling ash, Arya lowered her dagger and turned to look for her brother, who had not yet stirred upon the floor. Jon stirred. That was the first mercy. His fingers moved against the cold stone, and then his eyes opened, and Arya was there above him, her face streaked with ash, and something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but stood in the narrow country between them. He had not died. The silence had not claimed him. And when the two of them rose together and walked out through the shattered gates of the Red Keep, they walked into a world that had changed in ways no army could have measured, no maester could have predicted, no king could have prevented. Consider what remained. That is the question the survivors carried with them as they came up from the crypts and the cellars and the few strongholds that had held, blinking into a light they had not expected to see again. They had won. That word sat strangely in the mouth. They had won, and yet what they had won was a graveyard. The great houses of Westeros were extinguished, their halls empty, their banners rotted, their bloodlines ended in the long march of the dead from the far north to the sea. The Reach had been consumed. The Riverlands lay silent. The Stormlands, the Vale, the Westerlands, all of them thinned to scattered handfuls of the living who had hidden well, or run fast, or simply been forgotten by the tide of death that had rolled over everything. King's Landing itself was a husk. The greatest city the continent had ever built stood burnt and broken beneath its own ash, its streets choked with the fallen dead who had answered the Night King's call and now lay where his defeat had dropped them. And in the throne room, where centuries of Targaryen kings had ruled, the Iron Throne itself was gone, not toppled, not shattered, melted. The Syrians' blue fire, in the final assault, had washed over it and reduced the 1,000 swords of Aegon's conquest to a single formless mass of black metal, cooling now into a shape that resembled nothing so much as a wound. The throne that men had schemed for, killed for, betrayed one another for across 300 years, was slag upon the floor. There was nothing left to sit upon. There was nothing left to rule. Daenerys stood before it a long while. She had crossed the world for this. She had burned her enemies and freed the enslaved, and dreamed of the moment she would climb those steps and take what her father had lost. And now the steps led to a puddle of ruined iron, and the city beyond the walls held no living subjects to bend the knee, and the crown she had chased was revealed for what it had always been: a chair, a symbol, a thing that mattered only so long as there were people alive to believe in it. And there were so few people left alive. She did not weep. She had wept enough on the road south, watching the dead take everything. Instead, she turned from the melted throne and spoke words that would have been unthinkable to the woman who had first set foot on this shore. She renounced her claim. There was no throne to claim, she said, and even had there been, a throne was a thing for the ruling of the living, and the living now needed something other than a queen of conquest. They needed a steward, someone to hold the broken land together while it healed, if it could heal. She would rule not as the last Targaryen come to reclaim her birthright, but as the caretaker of a wound. And when the land had recovered enough to decide its own shape, she would let it. The dragon had learned, at the terrible cost of everything, that some victories are indistinguishable from defeats. Jon and Arya agreed to help her. The blood of the North, which had raised the first alarm against the dead, and paid the first and heaviest price, would not abandon the work of rebuilding now. There were empty holdfasts to be resettled, fields to be reclaimed from the frost, survivors scattered across a continent who needed to be found and gathered and given reason to hope. It would take generations. It might never truly be finished, but the alternative was to let the silence become permanent. And they had not fought through the long night only to surrender the world to emptiness now that the dead had fallen. Sam took up the last great task, the one no battle could accomplish. He recorded the truth. In the quiet months that followed, by candlelight in a half-ruined tower, he wrote down what had actually happened, all of it, so that it could never be softened into legend or twisted into flattery for the powerful. He wrote how the wall had fallen, how Winterfell had broken, how the dead had marched south, and the great houses had been too busy with their thrones and their grudges to unite until it was far too late. He wrote how close the world had come to ending, and how the ending had been averted not by any single hero, but by a girl with a dagger and a great deal of luck and the accumulated courage of the doomed. He wrote it plainly, because plain truth was the only monument the dead deserved and the only lesson the living could not afford to forget. And Arya laid the dagger to rest, the Valyrian blade that had ended the Night King, that had unmade the whole army of the dead in a single thrust. She carried it out beyond the walls to a quiet place where the ground had begun, at long last, to thaw. She did not break it. She did not hide it. She simply set it down in the earth and covered it over, letting it become part of the soil it had saved, a seed of ending planted in the ground of a new beginning. Some things, she understood, were meant to be used once and then let go. Spring came. It came slowly, as all true things do, the frost retreating inch by inch, the first green blades pushing up through the ash, the sun lingering a little longer each day upon a land that had nearly been lost forever. The long night was over. The world it left behind was smaller, sadder, emptier than the one that had gone before, changed utterly by the terrible closeness of its own destruction. But it was alive, and in the warming quiet, beneath a sky no longer haunted, the living began the patient, gentle work of building something new upon the ruins of all they had lost, and the story of how the dead had nearly won the world was written down and remembered, and finally, softly, laid to rest. Now this brings us to the end of this alternate history. If you enjoyed exploring how events might have unfolded differently, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. We dive into new stories from the world of Westeros every single day, imagining the choices, battles, alliances, and destinies that could have completely changed the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. And if you'd like to explore even more stories, our Lorekeeper members unlock a brand new exclusive alternate history every single week. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think would have happened next? Did this version of history end better than the original? Or would you have taken the story in a completely different direction? Leave your ideas in the comments, because many of the best future stories come directly from your suggestions. Thank you so much for watching, and for spending your time with me. I'll see you tomorrow with another alternate history from Westeros. Until then, peace out.